Well, welcome to the very formal Bible Beer Consortium here in Austin, Texas. I normally ask if this is your first time at an event, but other than the two of you that flew yourself in, I know it is. I want to thank Probe Ministries, Dr. Martin Pony, Search Ministries, and the always very appreciated BNBC Faithful Remnant members. We have individuals that support us with monthly donations as small as $5 that actually fund these events to keep them free. Tonight, we're very different. We're having a discussion. This is not a debate per se. Each week we'll have 20 minutes to present. We'll then have an hour-long discussion. We will then open the floor for Q&A over there. We'll have a Q&A until 8:50 and then closing statements. So we are here because my dear and good friend Matt Dillahunty got tired of driving to Dallas-Fort Worth to do events up there for me and said, why don't you come down here for once? So we're here. This topic was actually suggested by Matt as we initially posed it as a debate on which took priority. And Matt's response was, these entities are not going to go away, so how do we resolve the conflict? So I want to thank him in advance for his thoughtfulness in that. Tonight's first speaker on the topic, how do we resolve the conflict between LGBT rights and religious liberties, is Dr. Kevin E. Stewart. He's the Executive Director of the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture. He received his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, where he studied public law and political philosophy, and was a visiting scholar at the University of Cambridge. He earned a Master of Sciences from the London School of Economics and Political Science after receiving undergraduate degrees in history and English literature from Louisiana State University. He is the editor of the Catholicism and Society book series for the Society for Catholic Social Scientists, the Franciscan University Press. Please welcome Dr. Kevin Stewart.
Thanks. I noticed, and you may have noticed it as well, one of the many things I love about Texas is there can't be many other states in the Union where you will see a state flag without a national flag. But here, it's the Lone Star State. I think I've got that right, Micah. So the topic is, how do we resolve the conflict between LGBT rights and religious liberties? I was immediately put in the mind of a line from an old movie. Conflict? We don't have a conflict. We have conflicts, plural. I want to begin tonight by thanking Ezra and the Bible and Beer Consortium for bringing us all together, especially on an issue that tends to generate far more heat than light. My hope, and theirs I'm sure, is for this event to cool things down enough to concentrate on the actual arguments. That's especially difficult because, well, we're human beings, and human beings have the tendency to make decisions on an emotional basis and then search for reasons to justify that decision. Here, our challenge is to do something like the opposite, to see if we can bring our emotional commitments in line with where our minds tell us the reason of the thing lies. And for that reason, I found it impossible to decline Ezra's invitation to be here, even though Mr. Dillahunty is a much more experienced public speaker, thinker, and debater than I am. That said, I have given these issues some thought, and so even if you don't find that either of us has changed your mind at the end of the night, I hope that I represent one side of the discussion well enough that you think we're not all crazy. If I do that, I'll call it a good day. And so, on to the issues. What the proposition we're discussing asks of us is to arrive at some method for resolving the various conflicts that have, for some time, been arising between LGBT rights claims and religious liberty claims. My fear, if I might confess it, is that my response may frustrate most everyone in the room because I won't say that either side should win every time. But that's skipping ahead. Let's get there step by step. I think it's important to understand the context in which all these disputes are occurring. So let's pull the camera lens way back to see the whole scene. I think three context conditions of our society are worth noting and keeping in mind. Context condition 1. Many of the disputes between LGBT claims and religious liberty claims involve market transactions, the buying and selling of goods and services. These are the famous instances we know of the bakers and the musicians and the florists and things like that. It's important to understand that the market is not itself neutral about providing those things. It wants to provide goods and services that people want to buy. If you can make money doing it, somebody will probably do it. That will matter because it entails that in nearly every case, the failure of one vendor to provide a good or service does not foreclose the opportunity to get that same good or service from someone else. Take, for example, avocados. Avocados are crazy expensive right now, you may have noticed, and some stores aren't even stocking them. This is a problem for me because we have a toddler, and avocados are essential household items for toddlers. But the good news is that if H-E-B runs out, there's always Randall's or Super Walmart or Target. Context condition 2. The legacy of religious liberty stretches back centuries and is part of the DNA of the United States of America. From the Puritans in Massachusetts to the Catholics in Maryland to Roger Williams in Rhode Island, a lot of the early settlers of North America who came from Europe were seeking a place to live as their religion dictated. When the Constitution was adopted, the first freedom protected by the Bill of Rights, the freedom the founders thought so important that they protected it first, is the free exercise of religion. Note the subject of that clause, exercise. Exercise is not just about freedom of belief, but rather also freedom of practice. So it isn't enough that we are free to believe whatever we think is true, but also that our right to live according to these most cherished beliefs is protected. And while that right's not unlimited, and I'm sure we'll get into questions of where to draw the lines, in a contest between religious liberty and anything else in our society, there's supposed to be a big fat thumb on the scale for religious liberty. We can get into the technicalities of strict scrutiny and intermediate scrutiny and other Supreme Court ways of approaching these issues if we need to, but for now it suffices to establish that religious liberty is a very high priority in our history and in our constitutional order. Context condition 3, and this one's related to the first two. Our society has a strong tradition of freedom of association and contract. It's core to our country that we are allowed to create clubs, groups, and associations of all kinds, like this one, and get together and not only talk or complain about the government, but also buy, sell, and trade. From photos with the latest stars of the Marvel movies at Comic-Con to selling your old used car, American society now, as always, embodies the claim that one of the most important freedoms we have is the freedom to do work and business, both for-profit and nonprofit, without excessive interference. Think about it. You might write the occasional letter to the editor, and maybe some people here attend church once a week or even more, but I'll bet nearly everyone here buys or sells something or goes to work nearly every day. One of the things that makes our country exceptional is that the state always bears the burden of proof that it needs to restrict your freedom to do these things in order to advance a vital public interest. Otherwise, people are free to be friends with whom they choose, free to speak their minds, free to publish their opinions, free to buy and sell goods and services. So to review, the three context conditions that I think are important to bear in mind here are: 1, the market tends to provide things that people want to buy. 2, religious liberty is in America's DNA. And 3, freedom of association and contract are the default setting, and the state must justify any limitation imposed. Within that context, I want to add some principles and resources that our political tradition and the Christian moral and theological tradition offer to guide us through conflicts. Conflicts are, I think, in some sense, inevitable in a society as diverse as ours is. So how we approach them is important. I will speak as a Christian in a full-throated way, and some of these principles are specifically Christian. Even so, I think most are general enough that many who are not Christian can and may even agree with them. Principle 1, the dignity of LGBT persons, our relatives, neighbors, friends, and co-workers, is sacred, just as sacred as the dignity of our co-believers. If the heart of a conflict is mere disgust for a person, then we have forgotten that these are persons of infinite worth, each made in the image and likeness of God. The goal of society is everyone's flourishing to the greatest extent possible, and the law should be made to serve that purpose and uphold that dignity. Principle 2, religion is special. There is something about human beings such that wrestling with questions of religion, about whether there is a more than human source of meaning in the universe, and if so, what the proper response to it is, defines human life in ways that few other things do. This applies to, say, Dominican monks in an obvious way, but I think it's also true of many atheists and everyone in between. Take my counterpart, whose atheism is the basis of how most of us here know him. It might seem counterintuitive at first to put it this way, but Matt obviously thinks religious questions are vitally important to consider and to be right about, and so do I. Our answers are not just some among the many views we happen to have. They shape who we are and color much of the rest of what we do. So our answers to these questions are architectonic. They order our commitments in life and tie them together to make our lives a coherent whole. This is a key part of why religious liberty takes such a high priority in our society. Whatever the right answers are, people need to be given lots of space and freedom to pursue the questions by their own lights. I think I can safely speak for Matt, correct me if not, in saying neither of us wants you to adopt our position for any reason other than because you think it's true. Coerced answers about God are fake answers about God. Principle 3, people are going to disagree and we should put up with it. Where we can accommodate dissent with low to moderate social cost, we should. Except when absolutely essential to a vital public interest, we should prefer letting people stew in their wrongness. We should prefer that to forcing behavior that violates their consciences or forces them out of opportunities to live a good life. It's not unlimited, but the limits should be as far out as we can possibly make them. Principle 4, and this one's related to the rest. We should pursue peace and compromise with one another, seeking some way of living together that doesn't shut people out of the public square or foreclose opportunities for a good life. Okay, so briefly to recap here, the 4 principles are: the dignity of LGBT people and religious people, and indeed all people, is infinite and sacred. 2, religion is special. 3, accommodate dissent whenever possible. And 4, pursue peace and compromise. That's a long wind-up, I know, and I appreciate your bearing with it. So here's the pitch. In light of the 3 context conditions and the 4 principles, I'll now walk through several areas where these conflicts between LGBT rights claims and religious liberty claims occur and offer some specific thoughts applying all of this. Example 1, buying and selling, and that's bakers, florists, and such. A lot of the conflicts we're talking about occur in the marketplace. Consider the example of a baker in Colorado who was approached by a customer and asked to make a cake that touched upon LGBT issues. The baker felt he couldn't make the cake without violating his conscience, and so he refused. The customer filed a complaint. Now, what you need to know is it's not the baker you're probably thinking of. In this case, it was an LGBT-friendly baker asked to write something offensive toward LGBT people on a cake. He was asked to write, "Homosexuality is a detestable sin." I think few things would probably be more demoralizing to an artist than having to make a beautiful creation made hideous by a message you regard as violating your conscience. They have made the cake, to have made the cake would have violated his conscience and also damaged his craft. And so, especially in light of Principle 1, I think the baker was right to refuse, and more importantly, should have the right to refuse. But the principles that shape how we think about that case and that Colorado baker ought to apply to how we think about the other Colorado baker, the one who went to the Supreme Court in a case called Masterpiece Cake Shop. There, Scott, a different baker, refused to make a cake for a same-sex wedding celebration, and like the other case, a complaint was filed. Here we have a clear conflict between LGBT rights claims regarding discrimination and the religious liberty claims of the baker. Given all the context conditions and the principles I laid out, what solution can we arrive at? What legal outcome will satisfy all the principles within the given context of our society? Well, here's my take. Our legal system is largely based on the English tradition of the common law, and there's a very old distinction embedded in the common law between custom goods and services and off-the-shelf goods and services. I think this is an intuitive and powerful distinction that can do a lot of work to help us resolve these conflicts. See, with custom goods, the artist is much more entangled in the plans of the customer and the intentions of the customer than with the off-the-shelf items. As I was thinking on this, I remembered my own wedding. And I was reflecting on how surprised I was by how much attention the florist gave to all the details of our wedding and my wife's personality in order to come up with the perfect bouquet. Or the hairdresser who showed up at my apartment, which my wife and her bridesmaids had commandeered. I slept on the pull-out couch at my parents' Airbnb. He came early in the morning, and it was a real event, an integral part of the whole day. They had coffee, pastries, shared memories, and celebrated the anticipation. I could go on giving examples like this, but you get the point. Is it possible that someone totally divorces themselves from the rest of the activity when custom making things for people? Maybe, but the reality of these situations makes it seem fairly unlikely. And that's why the law makes this distinction. Custom goods and services like wedding bouquets are different from the flowers in the cold case at the bottom of the escalator in the Austin airport. Now, to turn to our bakers. If the bakers are open to the public and asked merely to sell a standard cake or the macarons in the display case or whatever things they routinely make, they should sell those to virtually anyone, almost regardless of any particular facts about the customer. There are some exceptions to this, like bartenders serving drinks to people who've obviously had too many and such as that. But basically, if you're open to the public and you make sandwiches, then you sell sandwiches to everyone who walks in, regardless of whether they're tall or short, skinny or fat, Muslim or atheist or Christian, gay or straight. So Christian bakers should sell standard cakes and other goodies to LGBT people and do so with kindness. But, you knew there was a but coming. But if you make custom goods, then you can accept or refuse contracts at your discretion for any reason or no reason at all. The custom tailor does not have to take the white supremacist contract for a neo-Nazi flag. The Muslim caterer does not have to accept a contract for a pig roast. And the bakers are not required to make cakes they feel would violate their consciences. This solution is consistent with the three context conditions I noted, and is an especially keen example of Principle 3, accommodating dissent, and Principle 4, pursuing peace and compromise in action. There's very little cost to anyone in allowing custom artisans to refuse contracts, especially given the background condition that the market will tend to provide someone who will say yes to that contract, and when compared to the social cost of compelling people to make custom goods against their consciences. This method not only protects consciences, though, it protects everyone's access to vital public accommodations by not covering off-the-shelf goods and services with the same protection. Everyone has access to those. Additionally, this approach has broad appeal, and some version of it has been endorsed by figures as far apart as conservative Catholic constitutional expert and Professor Jim Stoner, as well as prominent LGBT advocate and philosopher John Corvino. I will mention John a number of times, not least because he's a Longhorn. His PhD is from here, but also because he's a very civil interlocutor in these debates and a good model for how we ought to disagree when we disagree. Example 2, adoption. A number of states have implemented policies that forced religious foster and adoption agencies to shut down because they wouldn't place children with same-sex couple households, whether married or not. Professionals who dedicated their lives to caring for the least among us had the rug yanked out from under them, and so did the kids. This was worsened by the fact that faith-based agencies are often, if not always, better at keeping parents and guardians engaged, better at placing children, and better at placing special needs cases. Here we see the impact of Principle 2, religion is special. The religious milieu of the staff and the parents involved matters, and it shows in the results. Nevertheless, states have said if they insist on living by their faith commitments, they cannot be part of the network of foster and adoption care providers. This is a violation of Principle 3, accommodate dissent whenever possible. If they had done so here, everyone would have been better off. Given the profound need for foster and adoptive parents, the state should bear in mind Principle 4 and encourage more agencies rather than fewer, and should allow a diverse array of agencies to operate within general guidelines for health and safety. By failing to hold to Principles 3 and 4 and forcing one particular view of marriage on everyone, the state imposed a heavy cost to religious believers, and even worse, vulnerable children. And for what gain? The foster system in those states are now groaning under the weight of displaced children, and the most urgent cases, special needs kids, are exactly those now less likely to find placement. Furthermore, even before Obergefell, there were exactly 0 states where gay couples were shut out of adoption and foster care. If they were not able to adopt through a Christian agency, there were always alternatives. In failing to take account of the special nature of religion, in failing to accommodate dissent, in failing to pursue social peace and compromise, and instead opting for ideological purity, the state harmed children and compromised the dignity of religious believers. That's a tragedy. Example 3, hospitals and healthcare. With healthcare providers, much the same reasoning applies. People should not be forced on pain of losing their medical license or having the hospital shut down to participate in what they regard as unjustified killing, such as doctor-assisted suicide and abortion, or therapeutic approaches they think unwarranted, such as removing healthy organs or damaging healthy tissue in transgender patients. Where our society permits people to offer such services, that's one thing. But apart from the benefit of ideological purity, there's no pressing need to force every doctor to perform gender confirmation surgeries. In keeping with all 4 principles outlined above, and while ensuring access to urgent and life-saving treatments, medical professionals should be allowed to practice their faith and their profession by having the freedom to refuse to perform surgeries that violate their consciences. The social costs of allowing doctors to refuse these surgeries, as well as procedures like off-label use of powerful hormone therapies, is very low. The contrary position means the eventual closure of most religious hospitals and the foreclosing of medical professions to religious believers. Finally, my conclusion. Through these examples, we see the contours of my approach to resolving the conflicts which inevitably arise in a diverse and pluralistic society. I believe that politics is about finding a way to live together, given the sacred dignity of each person, and despite our many differences. If we're going to have the diversity our society increasingly prizes, we have to figure out strategies for managing it that don't step all over one another. Yes, my way heavily favors religious liberty claims, but that is justified by the background context of our society's history, our constitutional order, and the market's tendencies to provide whatever good or service a religious believer refuses to offer. I'm sure that in Q&A, we can have fun with hypotheticals and finding the limits of both the context conditions and the principles I've outlined here. But what I hope does not get lost in all that is that what I've tried to offer is a way through reason and charity to peace and compromise. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Matt Dillahunty, a skeptic, secular humanist, atheist, the incredible shrinking man, and he wears really nice snappy boots. In addition to being the host of the Atheist Experience TV show, president of the Atheist Community of Austin, and a board member of American Atheists, he's a popular public speaker, debater, and magician. He's recently toured Canada and the U.S. with his Magic and Skepticism show, and will be performing a portion of that show at Dragon Con as part of the Skeptics track. He's an outspoken advocate for the separation of religion and government and continues to work with organizations to ensure that our First Amendment freedoms are protected in a fashion that ensures that no religion is privileged over another or over a lack of religion. Speaking to tonight's topic, how do we resolve the conflict between LGBT rights and religious liberties, please welcome Matt Dillahunty.
I'm trying to get it to where it doesn't touch my beard. How's that? How you doing? Thanks for coming out. I don't think it's going to come as much of a surprise that there are things that we agree on, Kevin and I, and a number of things that we vehemently disagree on, and I'm right. I have a slightly different take on this, and it's funny because I'm not quite sure that I heard a path to resolving conflict so much as an assertion that religion wins. So this is going to be easy because I'm going to be doing the exact opposite and just asserting that it doesn't. So the topic for tonight's debate, how do we resolve conflicts between religious freedoms and the rights of black Americans? Oh, wait, that's not what it was. Or female Americans. Is that not done scratching? There we go. Or female Americans, or Muslim Americans. And you probably have a different reaction to some of those. And if you don't have a similar reaction to replacing that with LGBT Americans, you might be missing something. We have, yes, a First Amendment, and it does begin with a protection of religion. It begins by protecting religion from the government and guarantees that people are allowed to believe and practice. It also guarantees a freedom of speech and press and other things. So the First Amendment is not just one thing. But if we're going to address this, and as I pointed out several times prior to this debate, I'm not here to debate rights or what rights people should have. You can have discussions about what the limitations of rights are going to be. That's not it. To me, this is supposed to be a discussion about, hey, we live in a world where we have rights that are protected and we have people's religious freedoms that seem to come up against those things, and this is creating a conflict, so how do we address it? One of the questions that I like to ask myself is, what are they doing that impacts me? And what am I doing that impacts them? How is what they're doing impacting me at all? We have seen a number of examples of these, and Kevin mentioned a few of them. Yeah, I don't think we'll probably go into marriage equality probably much tonight because that's now settled. But there are other issues with relation to pharmacies, to abortion, to wedding cakes and venues and hospitals and other things like that. And the truth is, we've already solved these issues, and the current fight is really about getting people to obey the law when they think their religious views should trump the law. If a job requires you to do a particular task and your religion prevents you from doing that task, you don't do that job. If you want to be a pharmacist, but your religion prevents you from handing out contraceptives to people because your religion's opposed to contraception, you don't get to be a pharmacist, or you shouldn't be, unless you are willing to do the job, because a doctor has prescribed something for someone that is perfectly legal, supported under the law, and you are now putting yourself in a position of authority over the law because of your religious privilege, because of your preferences, and you are denying somebody else their rights. My right to swing my fist, as has famously been said, stops at your nose. And when your religious beliefs come in conflict with somebody else's rights, you lose. Full stop, no question. Rights are not subject to your personal opinion. And this is clearly evident. And I'll get to some of the points here that demonstrate why this must be the case. I mentioned today on the TV show a letter I once read about somebody who showed up at a football game in Hawaii and was very happy to hear that they were going to be doing a prayer before the football game, right up until the moment the prayer started. And the prayer was an indigenous prayer and not a Christian prayer. And this is what led to his understanding of why we have proper separation of religion and government, of why we shouldn't have government-enforced or government-led prayer in schools. Anybody who thinks that Madalyn Murray O'Hair took prayer out of school does not understand reality. Every time a test hits a table, there's prayer in school. What there isn't supposed to be in school is government-led prayer, government-sanctioned prayer, government-led Bible readings or Quran readings. And I have to include that because people are like, what's so wrong with reading the Bible in school? We should be teaching that. Okay, are you good with teaching the Quran too? How about Dianetics? How about all these other religious views that you don't share? It is the viewpoint of the people of the majority religion because they're in this incredibly privileged status. And as somebody who was raised primarily Southern Baptist and grew up in all of this, I had Catholic family, I had Pentecostal family, Baptist family, they would talk about each other, and it's like, oh, those are good people, but they're not really saved. Oh, the First Baptist Church can tell you what's wrong with the Second Baptist Church. This is the sort of environment that all of us grew up in and acknowledged a little bit, and it should be obvious to us about why we shouldn't be teaching the Bible in public schools in anything other than a literary sense, or here's its impact on society, but even those, as Andrew Seidel will point out, are dangerous. Now, the basic view for myself on freedoms is that we should begin with maximal freedom, the freedom to do anything and everything, and then as a society we begin to limit freedoms when there is a demonstration that there's a significant benefit to society to limit those freedoms, that the world would be better off this way. It's why we stop my ability to swing my fist just shy of your nose. We had to put that limitation in there in order to protect you, or actually probably to protect me, because I don't plan to be punching anyone ever. We begin with maximal freedom and then we begin to limit. But we can't limit too much. And the truth of this religious preference view is that religions don't agree. Which religion are you going to have win out for religious preference? Catholicism? Baptist? Pentecostal? Scientologist? What if I hadn't come up with a new religion, and my new religion's sincerely held conviction is that people who believe in the supernatural shouldn't be allowed to vote? Well, clearly, we're never going to implement that. We're not going to take away somebody's right to vote just because my religion, no matter how strongly I feel about it, thinks that because you believe in the supernatural, you shouldn't vote. And despite that, I could make strong secular arguments about what is or isn't reasonable and demonstrable that might convince people to say, you know what, people who believe in the supernatural shouldn't vote. I will never do that. I wouldn't support it if somebody else did it. Because the truth of the matter is that secularists, atheists, are quite often the most rigorous and robust defenders of freedom of religion, because we're in the position that we understand the majority religion doesn't need protection. When it comes to free speech, when you get cases before the Supreme Court about what people are allowed to say, it's never unpopular speech that needs, or popular speech that needs protection. It's always the unpopular speech that needs protection. The Constitution exists, and the Bill of Rights exists, to protect the minority from the whims of the majority, be they religious or otherwise. So if I have that view that, hey, if you believe in the supernatural, I just don't think you should be allowed to vote. And now we could spend the next 15 years arguing back and forth about whether or not you should have the right to vote. None of that's going to change whether or not you have the right to vote, because hopefully we're still living in a largely sane, okay, maybe that's not the right word given the current state of affairs, but we're probably not going to be taking away anybody's rights. And the truth is, for most of these problems, we already have a solution. We have a solution to the conflict, and the solution is the law. There's a difference between public organizations and private organizations. The Boy Scouts are a private organization. They get to be as bigoted as they want to. And while they've recently let girls participate and they have relaxed their view on homosexuals a bit, they still don't allow atheists to be scout leaders. They get to do that. I will support the Boy Scouts' rights to be ignorant bigots against atheists forever. But they don't get to get government money and subsidies from that. They shouldn't be allowed to come into public schools and recruit kids, because what they're doing is pitting kids against kids. I want to be in the Boy Scouts. Sorry, you can't. Your dad's an atheist. There's a reason we have other organizations, Scouting for All and other stuff like that, because you have every right to every view. You can be a white supremacist. You can be a true supporter of equality, where you can do the thing of saying, I don't see color. Please don't ever do that. It's not true. You see color, and it's kind of insulting to say that. But the solution to this problem is that we have public institutions and private institutions, and I'll go through some of the examples that he talked about. One of the things that Kevin talked about is that his view is that there's a big fat thumb on the scale in favor of religious freedom. But I couldn't possibly disagree more, which is why we're here. If there was actually a big fat thumb on the scale of religious freedom, then when your religious freedoms came in conflict with somebody else's rights, you'd win. That's not what the law does. It's not what the law codifies. It's not what we largely do. There are cases where it has happened. And in most of those cases, when we get to a point where we understand, hang on a minute, what if my religion's no longer the majority of religion? People begin to realize true religious freedom involves protecting everyone's right to believe as their conscience dictates and to act in accordance with those beliefs right up to the point where they impact other people. James Madison famously thought that the only actual proper application of the government with regard to religion was to resolve disputes when religions come in conflict with each other or with secular laws. That was it. That was his view on the First Amendment, is that if we're going to protect religious liberty, government should stay the hell out of religion right up until there's a problem. Because, A, the Catholics and the Protestants are fighting. Okay, now we're going to have to step in and we're going to have to say, look, you guys have these views and you're allowed to have them, but you don't get to, blow people up over them. Granted, we're not in Ireland, but... So you can be as good as you want, as bad as you want, as bigoted as you want, as supportive of equality as you want. What you can be and what you can think is independent from what you should be permitted to do. Now, he came up with 4 principles, and I think largely I agree with all of them to some extent. I'm not as big on the 4th one, which was to always pursue peace and compromise. I'm a fan of pursuing peace. I'm not a fan of necessarily pursuing compromise, because in many occasions, compromise is a really good thing. Certainly in interpersonal relationships, if you're out with your significant other and you're driving around and you say, hey, where do you want to go eat? And they're like, oh, I don't know, it doesn't matter, you pick something. And then you pick something and they're like, oh, not that. Okay, then you work out a compromise, because now we're in a relationship where we have to do something together. But in these other examples, we're not necessarily in a relationship where we have to do something together. Take the baker issues. If somebody comes into the baker and says, I want you to write this message on a cake, now we're talking about something where there's an expression of speech. My view is that as a baker, I'll write anything you want on a cake. I will. Doesn't bother me. You want me to write homosexuality is an abomination? Yep, there it is. Because nobody in their right mind thinks that message is coming from me, the baker. And I could have sold you a cake in the bag and let you write it on top of it yourself. And you're right, you may be able to find some other baker who's willing to do it. But should you be forced to do that? Maybe. And it comes down to whether or not you want to do business in the public sphere. Because if you open your business in such a way that is a private institution, I'm going to cook cakes out of my house and I'm just going to do it for friends and family and referrals, and I'll do custom cakes and stuff like that. You get to decide whatever you want to do. But if you open up shop and advertise and present yourself as a shop that is open to the public, you are now subject to what the public wants to do. Can we force you to make a cake? No. But also notice the difference between the examples. When Kevin came up with this example about the LGBT-friendly baker who was asked to write something they rejected on there, that was at least a speech issue. The famous cake example, the one that everybody was supposed to suspect we were talking about, there was no message. It wasn't, we'd like you to make a cake that says, woo, we're all gay and it's awesome. They said, we're getting married and we'd like you to make us a cake. There's no message on the cake at all. It's just a cake. The refusal on the part of that baker wasn't because of a message on the cake. It was about who that cake was for. And treating people under the law is the price you pay for doing business in the public square. The custom tailor, yeah, he doesn't have to make a KKK flag because that is speech and a message. But if a member of the KKK comes into a tailor that's open to the public and says, I'd like you to make me a suit, he's got to make that suit. Or, I mean, there are limits. You know, oh, I can't do it in this time or whatever else. But he doesn't get to refuse on the basis that this person is white, that this person is black, that this person is in the KKK, or that they suspect that the suit is going to be worn to a Klan rally. Because that guy's not going to show up in a suit and people are like, wow, which tailor made you that perfectly normal suit? Which baker made you that perfectly normal wedding cake? Because clearly they support the LGBT community or clearly they support white supremacists. It's just not the way that works. And when people say things like the market will bear this out, you know, oh, there's another baker, that is a myth that is born out of massive privilege. Quite often, the privilege of people who have money and live in a city. There are towns where there's one pharmacist, and if that pharmacist won't fill your prescription, won't provide you the medical care you need, you're screwed. You have to drive way out of town. There are small towns where there's one baker. But the issue is, even if there's multiples, why should your religious privilege force that person to start jumping through hoops because they don't conform to who you think they should be? The market may or may not give somebody another opportunity. That's not the question. The question is how much we inconvenience someone to make them go from baker to baker to baker to find the one that's not a bigot. You can take a look at the religious adoption centers. One of the biggest problems is that these organizations, like religious organizations, have had mountains of privilege, a privileged status with the entire government, tax-free status. And they convinced, because there's a question, should churches have a tax-free status? What do they provide to the public good that would warrant a tax-free status? And so churches have done amazing things. Hospitals, universities, adoptions. But if you're going to get in that realm and create a Catholic hospital that is open to the public, that treats people who are in need, you don't get to deny care because they don't fit your religious doctrines. And you shouldn't, even though I've heard about it happening. I have some friends who work in social work where a secular mother comes in and has a miscarriage, and they wind up not only having to go through this rigmarole, but they actually have to pay for 2 separate funerals. Because there's something within this particular church's doctrine that the fetus and the fetal matter, the afterbirth, which is often expelled at a later time after a miscarriage, are all birth matter, and so they need 2 funerals. So now you've taken someone who wanted a child, who lost a child, and you put them through the trauma of not only after they've had a miscarriage, having to deal with a funeral, but coming back and paying for a second funeral for the afterbirth. This type of stuff happens. But if you're going to create a hospital, you just have to do what a hospital does. You shouldn't be a Catholic hospital, because Catholicism has absolutely nothing to do with medicine. And Protestantism has absolutely nothing to do with medicine. You don't get to, when he talked about medical professionals should have the freedom to practice their faith and their medicine, yes, they absolutely should, but not necessarily at the same time, and certainly not when their faith comes in conflict with sound scientific practices and medical practices. In the adoption cases, these adoption organizations had an incredibly privileged status. They're like, hey, we're hooking kids up with families. What could be better? And the government gives them all sorts of benefits, and they're doing great. And now everybody's happy. I never sat around and thought about it and said, I'd like to adopt a kid, but if it's going to go through a Christian charity or a Christian adoption center, I couldn't do that, whatever. That's just bad. Nobody thinks like that until there's an actual problem. And the problem here wasn't that the government kept children from people who wanted them. It was religious people running a religious adoption service that kept those kids from people who wanted them, because the people who wanted those kids did not conform to the religious ideals and preferences of the people who were running that adoption organization. And on those grounds, I would argue that any religious organization that runs a church, a charity, an adoption center, anything like that, that is ever found to prioritize their religious faith over putting kids with families or treating people who are sick or filling a prescription should have their institutions turned over to the government or some other secular organization, which the government is supposed to be. We don't live in a Christian nation. My friend Andrew Seidel's here, was at the show early, and he's finished his book on the myth of the Christian nation, which we talked about on the show today. We don't live in that nation, and we shouldn't pretend that we do. Now, I've been I haven't been paying attention. I don't know how much time I have left. 5 minutes. Some of what I said probably caught some of you off guard. And if it did, you're probably religious. And you're probably blind to the privileged position that religions have had in our society seemingly forever. And in the same way that you can't understand what it's like, maybe instantly, to be a secularist who's being denied something because you're not religious, or a lesbian who's being denied something because they may even be religious. They may even share the same religion. There's plenty of gay churches all over town. We use Trinity United on occasion. Big cross, lots of rainbow flags, non-denominational, former Methodist church, gay-friendly. I was Southern Baptist. I know what the Bible says. I think it's bizarre that people are trying to make the Bible as if it's pro-homosexuality. It's not. But I'm much happier in a church where they've shed those ideas and decided, maybe the Bible's wrong about some stuff, so maybe we'll be better people. But they have every right to their views, as does everyone else. What they don't have a right to do is impose those views on other people, either through legislation or through denying services. I had to go to a hospital, probably the last time was 7 or 8 years ago. I was talking about this before because I had idiopathic anaphylaxis, and I had an episode and we made it there. It was a Catholic hospital, so there's a crucifix hanging above my bed. I got a picture, I think, at home of me laying in the hospital bed with a tongue swollen up on my mouth and a big crucifix behind me. And it was extra funny, you know, I'm a big atheist dude, whatever. Didn't bother me, and I don't care what the religious beliefs of my doctor are until the doctor says, you know what? God's given you over to a reprobate mind. You're a fallen sinner, a blasphemer. I am. I'm a blasphemer anyway. I don't accept the concept of sin, but I'm a blasphemer all day long. And because of that, we're just going to let you sit here and die. I don't think there's a Catholic hospital or Protestant hospital or religious hospital of any kind in the world that would take a look at me and say, you know what, you're an atheist. We're just not going to treat you. Certainly not in a life or death situation. But they seem to be okay doing it if there's not an emergency. If you have a perspective that is in conflict with their religion, they seem to think that there's a massive thumb on their side of the scale. When it comes to justice and law, there's no thumb on the scale other than freedom and equality. And if your religious views make it so that you cannot treat people equally under the law, you lose. That's the way laws work. That's the way rights work. You still get to believe however you want. You can even actively work to try to change the law. And we live in a fragile enough society that on occasion, a majority opinion on something has made it more difficult for other people in the world. The 18th Amendment, prohibition. That was pushed by religious people, predominantly, who thought that there was something wrong with drinking. And there's probably something wrong with some people drinking. But outlawing it for everybody was a catastrophe. Now, it could be the case that they could have been right about the effects of alcohol, and maybe the best thing that we could have ever done was to prohibit alcohol usage. I don't think it is. But the way to know that is through data, investigation, scientific inquiry, not revelation. Thanks.
Okay, we will now have a 1-hour discussion. I'm going to read a statement by Dr. J.P. Moreland. Yes. From his book regarding scientism. My question is, from each of you, with your perspective, what are you doing to fight against the scenario that I'm about to read? Quote, scientism warrants a shift in how we think about and practice tolerance, moving from a classic model to a contemporary one. According to the classical sense of the principle of tolerance, a person holds that his own moral views are true and are known by him to be such, and those of his opponent are false, but he still respects his opponent as a person, and he respects his right to make a case for his views. Thus, someone has a duty to tolerate a different moral view, not in the sense of thinking it is morally correct, but quite the opposite, in the sense that a person will continue to value and respect one's opponent, to treat him with dignity, to recognize his right to argue for and propagate his ideas, and so forth. Classic tolerance presupposes the reality of moral knowledge. For that reason, it cannot survive in a culture of scientism. And it is scientism that has led to the contemporary view of tolerance. The contemporary version of tolerance, popular in the general culture, goes beyond the classical version in claiming that one should not even judge that of other people's viewpoints as wrong. Thus, the very act of disagreeing morally with someone else is intolerant. Unfortunately, if scientism is correct, there is no moral truth or knowledge, and thus no real moral disagreements in the first place. This contemporary version of tolerance is deeply flawed for at least two reasons. First, it cannot be consistently asserted or lived out because those who affirm it imply that others do not share their views are wrong. In other words, people who follow this new version of tolerance do not tolerate those whom they consider intolerant. Second, it silences the moral protest of evils such as child molestation, racism, and so on. Why? Before one can morally protest something, he or she must judge it to be wrong and not worthy of being tolerated. Such is the culture in which we live now, and we have scientism largely to thank for it.
Sure, I can start. As soon as I get my mic adjusted there. Yeah. So who was that statement from?
J.P. Moreland?
Yeah, pretty sure I'll get in trouble for this, but virtually everything about that was wrong on both sides. So first of all, I don't think that what he's labeling as scientism is necessarily scientism, which is scientism is the view that science is the only way of knowing about the world, which is independent of to whether or not you're a moral relativist, which is what he's really complaining about, that, you know, under this new view, it's all moral relativism, you shouldn't judge, whatever a culture says is okay, there's no judgment. Under the old model that you were talking about of tolerance, I'm in agreement that we should respect other people as people and respect their right to hold views, but I don't agree with the added statement that then we then tolerate a different view. I just met Kevin today. I have as much respect for him as I have for any other person that I haven't interacted much before, which is surprisingly high compared to what some people do, because I just generally afford people that. He has every right to his views. He has every right to express his views. He has every right to lobby on behalf of his views, to vote on behalf of his views. And I respect his right to have his views, even though I may not respect his views themselves. And I don't mean in some cases by not respecting his views. I don't know. There's plenty of views you have where I'm sure we agree. When I say I don't have to respect his views, I don't just mean I don't have to agree with them. It means that to me, respect is that your view is now worthy of admiration, reverence, you know, in those categories. And that's not true. If you tell me that you're a white supremacist and that black people are inferior and Mexicans and Jews and everybody else is inferior to the master white race, I've pissed off quite a few people by pointing out that those people have every right to their beliefs. They have every right to express their beliefs. That right needs to be protected because the right that protects their right to express that is what allows me to express mine and you to express yours, etc. But I don't respect their view. I find it absolutely repugnant and would argue against it. There are occasions where maybe we're not talking about something as serious, where I say Shawshank Redemption was the greatest movie of all time, and you say Endgame was the greatest movie of all time. And I like them both enough to where, yeah, all right, I'll respect that perhaps we have a slightly different taste in movies or stuff, but that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about tolerance on issues that we view about morality. So I don't think scientism is the issue. I think what he's complaining about is moral relativism, and I'm far more in line with the old model of tolerance, with the exception of that one line about it puts us in a position where we must tolerate other views. And I think maybe by what he means, or if I always caution people not to pretend to read minds, because I do that all the time and I'm better at it than most people, and I can't actually read minds. But I think what he might mean is that we have to accept that we're going to live in a world where we're not always going to resolve every conflict and have to be willing to allow other people to follow their conscience. But I would say that goes right up to a point where it begins to affect other people's lives.
All right. I largely agree with that in the sense that I think what I would say perhaps instead of what Moreland said is that there's an odd paradox in discussions around tolerance today in that we don't want people to be judgmental, and yet at the same time we see a public sphere where people are getting shut down or canceled, I think is the Twitter lingo of the day, on these sorts of things, right? So we don't do exactly what Matt pointed to, which is get in dialogue with someone who's wrong, try to show them that they're wrong, but at the end of the day, neither try to run them out of the public square nor abuse them or anything like that, but simply recognize that this is a country with 330 million people. There's a pretty decent chance we're going to disagree about stuff fairly often, and that if we're going to have a life as a country together, then we're going to have to figure out how to make our way through all those disagreements and not kill each other.
Hey, on that note about judgment, we good? Yeah. I might have a position that isn't as shared as I would hope it would be. Because while once upon a time I was somewhere right of center politically, and now I'm somewhere way out left of center, certainly compared to where I was. When it comes to judgment, when it comes to ideas, I have no problem with being judgmental when it comes to ideas. I'm just not judgmental when it comes to people. And I try to make sure that I don't try to sum up the entirety of someone's character based on an idea or something they've done. I don't tend to view people as if, oh, that's a terrible person, so much as that's a person who's done something terrible. And I was talking recently about mental health issues, and I won't go through the whole thing, but if somebody's an alcoholic, and based on what we know about alcoholism, and we don't know everything about the brain and that, you could give somebody a ticket for driving while intoxicated, but you can't give somebody a ticket for being an alcoholic. And we've come to learn that it's probably a mistake. For years, it was, oh, you're just a drunk. You're the town drunk. And people were incredibly judgmental about the person without having an understanding of what was going on in the mind that leads to addiction, that makes people do things that a part of their mind desperately wants not to do, and yet they do it anyway. And so I got to a point where I stopped trying to summarize and judge people and instead judge actions. So I can't fault someone for being an alcoholic. I can fault them for what they do on behalf of that, if there were clear other options, if they're not taking the steps. So it's kind of like I have no problem being judgmental about ideas. I'm probably extra judgmental about ideas on a regular basis.
Let's start. You have a question for Matt?
Sure. My attention came during his presentation to a tension that I detect, and so I want to let him expatiate a bit on that, specifically with the treatment of the First Amendment, where on the one hand, he was, as he should be, an absolutist or near absolutist about freedom of speech. We do not limit speech at all based on harms to dignity or emotional pain. We agree that the cake baker does not have to write the insulting message. And yet, the free exercise of religion is also in the First Amendment. And he was quite happy to really limit that much more significantly so that if anyone is inconvenienced in the least by your free exercise of religion, then you no longer have free exercise of religion. And I would ask, how do you distinguish between those two?
Sure. So first of all, I'm not a free speech absolutist, and I don't think that accurately characterizes what I really think, although it may be accurate to the parts that I actually talked about. Because we do limit speech, and on occasion we do limit speech with regard to dignity and emotional pain, because if you slander or libel someone and you can show that there's damages related to that, then there are consequences to that. Similarly, I wouldn't suggest that people's ability to exercise their religious views should be stopped if they cause anyone inconvenience, because you can certainly, like any other citizen, have a religious parade that would inconvenience loads of people, that would make it more difficult for them to get to work. It may even prevent an ambulance from getting to the hospital. And yet, this isn't about inconvenience. And it's not even speech that I would hold as the primary thing, but individuals' autonomy and identity, the right to have governance over your own life. So I'm only talking about when religious liberties come in conflict with people's rights, not when somebody is inconvenienced. Now, we talk about church-state separation issues, and on occasion you'll see a small town with a nativity out front. I have money. Well, actually, I don't have money. I was going to say I have money in my... Oh, I do have money in my wallet. I thought I didn't. That doesn't inconvenience me that since 1954, my money, or all of my life, and then some, because I'm not quite that old, says "In God We Trust" on it. It didn't used to say that prior to 1954.
You have a $2 bill.
I have two $2 bills.
Forgive my interruption, but
The strippers are incredibly impressed by it.
You have a $2 bill.
I actually have a couple of them. I don't have one with me. I have one from 1934 that doesn't have "In God We Trust" on it, and I have one or two modern ones that do. It doesn't inconvenience me to have "In God We Trust" my money. I wish it wasn't there. We had a perfectly good motto e pluribus unum, out of many one, that's about unity. We had a pledge that said one nation, indivisible. And then in the fear of the godless communists, we injected the single most divisive phrase I can imagine, under God, directly before the word indivisible, which I find incredibly ironic. Now, this isn't about inconvenience. It's not a mere okay, you had to go from one bakery to another to another. Yeah, that could just be viewed as an inconvenience. On the other hand, what was actually happening is this shop is open to everybody but you. That's not just an inconvenience. That is you are not the type of person that I want to do business for. I do not support you or your lifestyle or anything else, so you can go jump through some other hoops. Now, I fully support, and I'll probably get in trouble for this too, if you're a baker and you don't want to make a cake for somebody, don't. But in much the same way that I can fire you and never give a reason, if I give you the reason that I fired you because you're a Christian or Catholic or Protestant or whatever else, now all of a sudden I have done something that enters into the realm where I have marginalized someone because of who they are, which would be a violation of their rights. And so, yeah, I guess you could just tell bakers, just don't bake the cake and tell them you're too busy. But if you're proud enough to say that you're going to do it because you don't like who the person is, then you are in violation of, now it gets down to what we're going to define as protected classes. I get that. But we're talking about whether or not we're marginalizing people, not just inconveniencing. And I'm not a free speech absolutist. I'm fine with sensible limits. I'm sensible. Fine with sensible limits on anything.
But of course, the view you just laid out of the baker is not what the law is, right? Because the Supreme Court went the other way in that case.
Yeah. So that's. Now we're into the sticky thing because the Supreme Court has, I would argue, gotten it wrong on many occasions.
Me too.
We both think that. So neither one of us are arguing on behalf of a purely legalistic view as whatever the law is, that's what's right, because we know that's not the case. At one point, the law was you can't drink alcohol or produce alcohol, and now we've changed that back. And we can have disagreements about which way it should be. It's not about what the current state of the law is. It's about the founding principles in our Constitution that guarantee our right to autonomy and self-governance, and the limitation of those freedoms only when there is a present, strong need in the public interest. And I find no need in the public interest to say, you know what? I can say whatever you want about you. I can refuse you service for who you are. I can refuse to... here's a gay couple who desperately wants to adopt a child. Here's a child who desperately wants a family. And we have statistics showing that single parents can be good parents, gay couples can be good parents, that in many cases, children who grow up with gay parents outperform those children who don't. You can cherry pick whatever statistics you want, but at the end of the day, if you're going to say, no, I'm not going to match this child with these parents because these parents have views that don't match my religion, now I would say you are not just inconveniencing people, but you are damaging people. And I'm not saying you do this. I'm not directing any of this directly at Kevin. And that's where the problem comes in. Do I care what a baker does? No, not up until the point where they want to be applauded for being a bigot.
Do you want to? Your turn. I was going to let you take a turn.
Yeah. So how do we resolve a conflict between your religious freedom and somebody else's religious freedom when those are in conflict?
Yeah, so it will depend. It will be circumstance dependent, right? So if they're the proprietor, and so I'm a Catholic. Suppose it were required of Catholics that we have a cake to celebrate our weddings, right? It's not, but suppose it were.
It should be.
Yeah. Suppose it were, and someone else's religious, someone else was a serious Calvinist and thought that the Roman Catholic Church is the whore of Babylon sort of stuff, right? And so I definitely don't want to make a cake for you. Well, there, I think, for all the reasons I gave, our context, given our legal environment, our cultural history, our constitutional order, the question is whether the baker has to accept any contract that comes his way. And it's just never been part of our legal order that you must accept every contract. And what Matt has advocated just now is that if you do business in the public, you have to sell people whatever it is that you sell, right? Whatever it is you do, you have to sell it to anyone who wants it. And I make a distinction in saying, to the extent that you make off-the-shelf goods, so you have the delicious macarons under the cabinet, which, by the way, the baker did not refuse to sell those. The Masterpiece Cake Shop is happy to sell the standard cookies, cakes, and other things that they do. It's the custom order that was refused. And the legal principle, long-held legal principle in our legal order, backed by now 2 centuries plus of First Amendment Supreme Court cases, is that with totally custom goods, it is the right of the person whose work it is that's being requested to say yes or no to that contract. That we don't force that on them.
Yeah, I don't know if that necessarily, I mean, it kind of obliquely addressed the conflict between your religion and somebody else's, but because I've kind of, maybe I haven't been clear, because I've kind of been mischaracterized again. At no point am I saying that you're required to accept every contract that comes along. I've never said that or suggested that. What I was talking about was you have to treat all, if you're going to open it up and have a business in the public sphere, you have to treat all customers equally under the law. And so it's about, as I pointed out, the reasons for why you're going to do this. And if you are going to openly say, no, I won't make, can a baker just say, hang a plaque there that says as a policy, I won't make cakes for gay couples? Can they have a plaque there that says, I won't make cakes for black people? I won't make cakes for Muslims. I will only make cakes for Protestants. Now, if they were a private thing, you can have whatever restrictions. You can have a men's only club. I guess if you're gay, that'd be really good. But outside of that, it's probably not the kind of club I would want to go to. But I'm not suggesting you're required to accept every contract. The law has protected classes, and one of the things is that we haven't included potentially every potential protected class under there. And so if I ask, could you hang a placard that says we won't sell cakes to black people? Race is a protected class, and you just couldn't do that. But you could also have a bakery right now and never take an order from a black person and probably be fine under the law until somebody made a case that you're essentially doing the thing of like hanging the placard out there. So I just for clarity, I don't think you're required as a individual proprietor to take every contract that comes in. You can have your own reasons. It's the message of denying on certain grounds. That's where the problem comes in, because it reinforces ideas about these people are not our people, and these people shouldn't have the same access to goods and services that our people do.
So you can do the thing as long as you don't say why you did the thing.
Yeah, and that may make you a terrible person, but you're never going to be in a position where you're talking about violating somebody's rights, because you can always lie about what your motivations are. It is very difficult to show what somebody's true motivations are. It's one of the most difficult things in court cases to get up and show that this person did this because they have this particular view. And before anybody goes down that road, I'm already on record as being almost entirely opposed to anything that comes close to hate crime legislation, because if you kill somebody, that's already illegal, and judges can already take the circumstances and impact and motivation into account. The fact that I killed Zach because I hate bearded people makes me a bigot, but it doesn't mean that I've done something. Yeah, Ezra, you're fine. Your beard is supreme. Zach's is a pale comparison. Oops, sorry.
But in fairness to Zach, all beard is pale by comparison.
Yes, there are a few that are that magnificent. So you viewed this idea that perhaps because it's at the beginning of the Bill of Rights, the protection of religious freedom is special, I think is how you refer to it. And whenever I hear the word special or anything that segments something off as special, the arguer in my head immediately goes to special pleading. And so anytime you want to claim something is special, there needs to be a justification. You were talking about it as this is the first thing we protected. And actually there was some fighting over whether or not we needed a Bill of Rights at all, because every one of those freedoms that was expressed in the Bill of Rights is something that wasn't prohibited by the Constitution anyway. And some of the Founding Fathers had this notion that, well, if we start codifying what people are permitted to do and what rights are protected, there were people who would come along and argue that these are the only rights that we have. And so that's why I begin with, maximal freedom and limit, rather than here's a constitution that provides you maximal freedom, and now we're going to codify these things as special freedoms. I had a guy email me the other day to ask if we should repeal the Second Amendment, and I was like, yeah, that's not going to happen. No matter what your view is on guns, that's not going to happen. This is the problem. It's so difficult to do. So how or why should labeling a position a religious freedom give it primacy over any other non-religious freedom?
Right. So I think there are two parts to to answer that. The first is precisely because it's free exercise of religion that's specified and enumerated within the Constitution for special protection. So it's special in part because, as you well said, there are lots of freedoms that people have that weren't marked out for special protection. It is easier, therefore, to limit those, right? Because limiting them for some public reason, for some pressing public need, does not create a constitutional case because there's no constitutional nexus. So the first part of the answer, then, is that it's special precisely because it's marked out. And there are only 27 amendments to the Constitution, 2 of which counteract, right? So there are really only 25 operant amendments to the Constitution. So this hasn't happened very often. There are not that many things that we've picked out and said that we're going to specially protect. But then you might just ask, kick the can backwards one step and say, well, why'd they do that? And I think the answer to that I got to a bit in the presentation is that for both of us, even though we disagree about what the right answer is to questions regarding God, those questions are architectonic. So not all views are created equal, and we all sort of know that in the sense that my preferences regarding ice cream are not as important as my preferences regarding sports teams, which are not as important as my thoughts about religion. And that is because religion is architectonic, so questions about God and the meaning of the universe and the meaning of life, right? These questions shape other questions, most other questions. They impinge upon many of the other facets of our life. And I offer you no better example than the gentleman to my right, whose professional life is largely surrounded by this issue and shaped by this issue, as many other people's both personal and professional lives are. And so there are two parts to the answer of what it is that makes religion so special. It's just part of the answer, but those are two. That's where we can start.
Okay, I heard an explanation of why it might fit a different category, and I could certainly. I have glib answers about how it's in a special category itself, but I'm not here to do that kind of thing. So, for example, one of the other things that happened even before the Bill of Rights was the Constitution's Article 6. Now, whether or not we ever got a Bill of Rights, you would have freedom of religion, freedom of religious belief and expression, because it wasn't anything that was prohibited. There were people who were concerned, hang on a second, I don't think the Constitution goes far enough to make sure that I can do these things. It just doesn't prohibit it. So I want you to actually codify and list it. Cool. Except that in Article 6, it explicitly says there'll be no religious test for any public office or trust. And through the entire Constitutional Congress, every time somebody suggested that we include a reference to God in the Constitution, it was voted down. You have the views of the original Founding Fathers. Both Madison, who viewed that the only justified application of government with regard to religion was to settle conflicts between them. So clearly we recognize there were conflicts between religions then, although I don't think that's going to come as a surprise to anybody. In light of Article 6, I realize that individual rights certainly don't qualify as a public office or trust. And so Article 6 doesn't necessarily provide people religious protection. But it seems clear that if we're going to not include God and religion in the Constitution and expressly vote it down and create the Treaty of Tripoli that blatantly says the United States government's not in any way founded upon the Christian religion, and taking a look at Jefferson's letter to Danbury that where the phrase separation of church and state is coined for the first time. These are the thoughts of the founders, and I'm not an originalist. I don't think we're beholden to them at all. But it would seem clear that when in Article 6, when it says there would be no religious test for any public office or trust, this is a view on religion that we shouldn't be making determinations about people's qualifications for office or their eligibility to participate in the government or their rights as equal in society on the grounds of religion.
I think I agree with all except depending on what you mean by that last bit. I mean, I certainly
specifically
agree
refers to public office or trust.
Yeah.
It seems to me to betray a mindset that was we need to all be equal and have equal access into the law, irrespective of our religious views. Otherwise, if there was an alternate view, that one religious view or a religious type of view should have preference, we would see that codified, as we do in the state constitutions. Even in Texas state constitution, it still, and will always say at the outset, or I forget which article it is, that no one can run for office in Article 4. Thanks. No, I brought my reference team. No one can hold office in Texas unless they acknowledge a higher power, or might say God or a higher power, something along those lines. Yet the Supreme Court's ruled that entirely unconstitutional. Anybody can run for office anywhere. We've fought this battle over and over again. And I mention it in this debate, I apologize, not because it's especially relevant to this, but because I'm sick to death of having atheists email me saying, my state constitution says I can't run for office. How do we fix that? And I'm like, we fixed it in the 50s, and we fixed it again with Herb Silverman and other stuff. But that mindset of creating a society that is free, where we are equal, without respect to what a religious views, is in conflict with the notion that religion should have some preferred status, like a thumb on the scale. And you view the First Amendment as if, here's that justification for the thumb, and I view the First Amendment as these are freedoms that were already guaranteed. It's just that there were people panicking that if they weren't codified, they wouldn't have them.
I mean, there may have been people who viewed it that way. That's certainly not the way the law goes right now, right? So there are lots of others of my freedoms, lots of other freedoms that each of us has, that the state can and does impinge upon through regulations all the time. But it had better not infringe upon our free exercise of religion or our freedom of speech or freedom of the press unless it wants to get sued, because that's what's going to happen. And the reason that's the case is because we have, whether we needed to or not, that was the Federalist argument. There are a lot of things the Anti-Federalists turned out to be right about. This is kind of one of them. But as things happened, if it's not marked out there for special protection, then in fact it is a lot easier for the state and for the government to pass laws and ordinances that limit or otherwise trammel that initial freedom that you mentioned that people start with. And so that's the thumb right there, in that things that are marked out for special protection, it's just, I mean, sure, I'm happy to back the normative claim that they should be, but prescinding from that, it's just a fact that everything marked out for special protection by the Bill of Rights is much harder to infringe upon, even for pressing public need, than things which are not marked out for special protection.
Yeah, and I agree with that. One of the kind of newer examples are Native American religious beliefs that allow them and require them for their ceremonies to use drugs which are prohibited by the government. And so, the government's prohibited these particular substances, and now you're infringing on my rights. So of course we should have a lawsuit that actually addresses that. And I think it's a legitimate question, because I have no problem. If somebody you want to get high, get high. I don't care if it's part of your religious thing or not. You can, do whatever you feel you need to do. That doesn't mean that I'm in favor of the legalization of all drugs. I mean, clearly there's a difference between aspirin and heroin. I didn't even need to take either of them to know that that's a difference. And so when the government puts those limits on religious freedoms, they are usually, I would hope, and they definitely should be, backed by a dramatically strong impact on the public. Like, we can't have your little group dealing drugs and having it be okay without affording that to everybody else. The other thing that may be particularly scary about that is that all of us, well, no, I shouldn't say us, because I'm not that fond of getting high, but all the people who are of no religion who really want to get high, just go join that religion. And maybe that religion takes over. And all of a sudden, instead of having some version of Christianity as the majority religion, you have that. None of that is relevant to whether or not there's an interest with regard to public threat. And actually, I don't even remember what the final resolution of that case was. I think they were prohibited.
So that's Employment Division versus Smith, an Oregon case. And there, Smith, actually Matt gets the details just right, Smith and a friend of his were Native Americans who used peyote ceremonially as Native Americans do, but they were employed as alcohol recovery counselors, and it was a condition of their employment that they could not consume prohibited substances or drink, I think even drink alcohol. I think that was part of the deal, but I'm not 100% sure about that. So they sued, saying they needed to consume the peyote, which has mescaline in it. I don't know a lot about drugs, but I do know some con law, so that's where I learned that.
I can fill in the part about the drugs. You handle the law, and
Okay.
I'll take the drugs.
So that went all the way to the Supreme Court, where, much to many people's surprise, Justice Scalia led a majority to say that when the government passes neutral, generally applicable laws which do not facially target one religion, and I'll give you an example of what that would look like to contrast, then for a compelling state interest, then they can incidentally infringe upon religion. And so their termination was upheld because they were obviously fired from their job once they tested positive on the drug charge. Now, an interesting twist, so two interesting twists, and that case is kind of bounded, if you want to feel the tension, by a case called Hialeah, which is where a Santeria church announced that it was moving into the Hialeah neighborhood, which is in the Miami area. And as part of the Santeria practices, they intended to ritually slaughter chickens. And so Hialeah moved very quickly. The city council passed an ordinance that said you may not ritually slaughter animals that are not for consumption. And the Supreme Court struck that law down. So this will draw the tension out. They struck that law down because they said this obviously is targeting, I forget the name of the church, but it has a very funny name, or it seems funny to me anyway. And so that's kind of the tension that they live with. Now, the other twist is that Congress responded to Employment Division versus Smith. It was very controversial with a law that has only recently, that sort of was uncontroversial for like 20 years and then now all of a sudden has become very controversial. Perhaps you've heard of RFRAs, RFRAs, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act.
Yeah.
That was in 1993. Congress passed that. It's almost impossible to imagine in this day and age. Congress passed that unanimously in the House, and nearly unanimously in the Senate, 97 votes, and President Clinton signed it and celebrated it.
And they were all wrong.
Said it was a great thing. So you're with Scalia.
Oh gosh, don't ever say that. Especially
I
now
knew
that
that
he's
was going to be
dead.
the reaction.
Yeah, no. I despised Scalia's views on a number of things, but I also agreed with him on a handful of things. And I'm one of the people who, despite the fact that I want RBG to live forever, I can at least understand how she could be friendly with him. And it's the same reason why I've done a lot of debates with a lot of theologians, and a great many of them I'm actually friends with and talk to outside of it, because while people may see this as sometimes a WWE-like event of, oh, I need to beat Kevin up and he needs to beat me up. Getting back to the first question that Ezra asked on tolerance, while I don't agree or respect, I cannot respect a view that I don't respect. I don't have any choice in what my beliefs are, and I don't have any choice about what I find valuable, et cetera. I still find Kevin valuable as a person. I find these discussions valuable for the people who may be having them elsewhere to see if they hear a point that they didn't. But the last couple of points we made actually was about the government imposing upon religious beliefs. And at the end of the day, even the First Amendment is potentially subject to being overturned. If you wound up with a society that was predominantly atheistic and stupid, they could repeal the First Amendment. They could repeal the Second Amendment. They could repeal as many of them as they wanted to. I don't think those are likely because we generally have learned about those protections. But what we're kind of talking about here is when there's a conflict between someone taking an action on behalf of their religious views and someone being afforded the rights of every other citizen. My objection comes down to when that rejection comes on the base of something about that person not comporting with their religion rather than a secular motivation. You can have a religion that is fully consistent with providing secular motivations for things. You can have a religion that says you shouldn't drink alcohol. Now, as a Southern Baptist, I was raised that way. Other members of my family who were Catholic or otherwise are not. We're here at the Bible and Beer Consortium, so I think I'm largely in company that might enjoy an adult beverage on occasion. But if we're going to look at a motivation to prohibit something, the fact that you have a religious view doesn't mean that's incompatible with a secular view. It is only when there's no secular justification and only a primary religious justification that winds up marginalizing citizens and making them do extra because of, not yours, but whoever's religious beliefs. And so probably the biggest issue, which everybody's been terrified of the word since we walked in the room, even though it doesn't have anything specifically to do with LGBT rights, is abortion. It is the touchstone hotbed issue. I have family and friends who are single-issue voters. Whichever candidate is opposed to abortion, that's the one that's getting their vote, no matter what their other positions are, no matter how bad it might be, even if there's absolutely no likelihood that they're going to overturn Roe or change these things. And so I'm not aware of a primary motivation on the abortion issue that is anything other than like a religious or deeply held personal conviction about a moral issue. And if we're going to be in this position where, there's some glib responses like, you don't want an abort, you think abortion's wrong, don't have one. You think gay marriage is wrong, don't marry another person of the same gender. And I get that those are unconvincing because what we're talking about is the broader world and the society we build. And if your view of society is such that a world that permits A, B, C, and D is somehow morally corrupt and defunct, I understand why people would want to act on those. But I have views that society is morally corrupt and defunct because of many positions that religious people are pushing. I find the notion, that's why I said I like some of the gay-friendly churches better. They're not on good biblical foundations, but they are on better humanistic foundations. So if we're gonna look at this and kind of touch on the subject of the debate or discussion, what do we do? And I mean this in all seriousness, because when somebody asks me, how do we resolve a conflict between somebody's personal religious conviction, or even an organization's religious conviction, and somebody else's rights, I already stated at the outset, the rights went out. The law wins out. And so it seems to me that the resolution of the conflict is you have every right to your views, be they religious or otherwise. You have a right to express them. You have a right to attempt to change the law, as does everybody else. And that we should all agree that we should work within the bounds of the law and treat people with dignity and respect and give them access to something. Because that baker, what potential harm or hindrance to that individual existed in agreeing to make a wedding cake for a same-sex couple? I have no idea. He's going to get paid. He's going to do a job. That cake is going to be the same cake. Granted, they're custom. I get you want to make a distinction between off-the-shelf goods and custom goods. I don't see the relevance in that distinction, because if I make custom goods, I make them for anybody who walks in the door, right up until I don't have the time or whatever else. But if I say, I'm going to make custom goods, but I'm not going to make them for the gay folks, what harm would it do that baker to make that cake?
Well, the baker's view is that it would have harmed his conscience, right? That he would have been formally complicit, is the footnote 34 in Hobby Lobby language. That he would have been formally complicit in the wedding and did not want to be. So I think it's totally fine for you to, and I completely understand why you think he's not harmed, why you think he's wrong. The question is whose whose right is it to decide? And my claim is that it is the long history of both our economy and our constitutional order that people who make custom goods get to say who they make those for. And they can refuse people for no reason and any reason at all. Now, contrast that with making off the rack or off the shelf goods. When there are basic goods and needs for the flourishing of everyone, so food, shelter, clothing, and you make and purvey those things, and you're open to the public, then what you have agreed to is basically to sell to all comers. But in a society full of people who are going to disagree about things the way Matt and I disagree about questions about God, we have to find a way to make room for me. And Matt's way of saying the only reasons we're going to have respect for are the secular reasons. You're free to not hire someone because you think they walk funny. But if you want to not hire them because you prefer for your small business to be Christian, populated by Christians, well, now we can't have that.
You can. I have no problem. You want to open a Christian-only business that's only open to Christians, that's fine. That's fundamentally different from saying you open to the public. And when I say that, yes, if you want to have a justification for limiting something, it needs to be secular, that's because we have a secular constitution and a secular government that does not take religious views into account when determining rights and freedoms.
But that's not true. The First Amendment does exactly that in protecting the free exercise of religion.
So it protects the free exercise of religion, that's what it says, but that does not mean that you have the freedom to do anything and everything and claim that this is my personal religious conviction. There are limits on that. We've made tons of them.
Yeah. Right, but what those limits are, as Scalia mentioned in the Smith case, are that you have to have a compelling governmental or state interest. So it has to be something really important for the public to have that's at stake.
Is it not a compelling government state interest to make sure that its citizens have equal access to goods and services?
And then whatever the law is, whatever the ordinance is, has to use the least restrictive means available to ensure the accomplishment of that public interest.
Yeah, I don't think anybody was suggesting that we make a law that forces everybody to take every contract or anything else. The primary objection, I'm not even convinced that this was fully a legal objection so much as an ethical one about how we treat each other. And the cake things, quite honestly, while I'll talk about it all day and I have my views, I'm not overly concerned about it, but that's because I'm in the incredibly privileged status of probably never being denied cake. For years, nobody would deny me cake, even though I was a diabetic and probably it was killing me. But this goes beyond this. When we're talking about LGBT rights and freedoms, one thing we haven't addressed is marriage equality. And I suggested earlier on that we may or may not touch on it because I don't know how much. Are you fine with the fact that the government now allows same-sex couples to marry?
So I have a view on marriage, and I wrote it out because I thought this might come up. And so my view on marriage is this. It's what I'll call, for shock value if no other reason, the liberal case against same-sex marriage. I think government needs a good reason to take an interest in my personal relationships with other people, whether those are romantic or friendships. A good reason to restrict and regulate our associations with friends and lovers. And most of the time, government does not, in fact, regulate my personal relationships. The state doesn't care whether I'm on good terms with all three of my sisters, nor did it oversee my breakups with girlfriends before I got married. And that's as it should be. The exception is this. The state has an interest in what liberal philosopher John Rawls calls the orderly reproduction of society through time. That is, society wants to keep going in the future, and that means it needs kids. So society has an interest in the kind of relationship apt to issue in children, making it more difficult for the parents to split up, which increases stability, health, safety, and happiness for the children. Thus, society has a justification for regulating that relationship. It does not have a justification for regulating other friendships or romantic relationships not of the type apt to issue in children. Is that sufficiently opaque?
Stupid government.
No, it's pretty clear, although I'm mildly shocked. I wasn't quite sure exactly what you would say or how you'd come down on this. I almost wish this had been an entire discussion about marriage equality, except there's no reason to do that since it's legal and should be. And the argument about, first of all, as soon as you said that the government has some interest in regulating romantic interests, I flinched, but I got over it.
Well, I said it normally doesn't, right?
Yeah. You mentioned John Rawls. I think probably the most important thing we can all learn from John Rawls is this notion of the veil of ignorance, which is design the society you want to live in, not knowing who you're going to be in that society. It removes our biases. And so that actually is how I would address other questions. Are you willing to live in a society that allows slavery, not knowing whether you're going to be a slave or a slave master? Are you willing to live in a society that will marginalize LGBT people in favor of religious privilege if you don't know if you're going to be part of that particular religion or part of the LGBT community? And the veil of ignorance is the best thing that we can do to be as objective as possible. We're always going to be subjective. But first of all, the only marriage that counts or matters is the one that is sanctioned by the government. You can get married in your church and never get a marriage certificate. The government's not going to recognize it. You're not going to get the benefits of that. A religious marriage ceremony is something that is just within the church. It doesn't exist outside of there. On the flip side, if I get married legally by the government, churches will still recognize that as a marriage. Most of them, unless I happen to marry a man, and then some of them won't. But when I was married to a woman, and technically I still am for a few more days, there's not a church if we walked in and said, oh, this is my wife, this is my husband. Nobody would have flinched, balked, cared, anything else. Now, on the notion of society's duties to protect kids, nothing about gay marriage impacts anybody's ability to have kids. There are debates, 50-some-odd% of marriages end in divorce anyway. When people talk about the sanctity of marriage, the government has, as you suggested, has a motivation to keep families together because that's where families are good, except that's not the case. Divorce is often a very, very good thing, and it can be a very good thing for the children if remaining in a hostile marriage environment is more damaging to the kids than moving on. If everybody is miserable, a divorce may not instantly solve everything, but it allows people to move on. It's because of this myth that we have soulmates, that we should be together forever. We have built up a false image of what an actual relationship is. I was married for, it'll be just close to 8 years. I still love my ex-wife. We still talk every couple of days. We had some issues come up to where it was no longer a good idea for us to be married. She agreed with that. I agree with that. Pretty much anybody who knew us and knew the details of it said, yep, it's probably best for you guys to split. Now, fortunately, we didn't have conventional kids. We did have 4 cats, and she ran off with all 4 of them, and I should hate her for that, but I don't, because the cats love her, and she loves the cats, and I travel. So I'm glad the cats are happy. If we would teach people how to be, adult and have realistic expectations about what relationships should be, a lot of those issues fade away. But I would argue, and not to just beat up on the Catholic Church, but any religion that sets up incredible barriers to divorce and roadblocks to divorce, even if it was done with the best of intentions of saying, you don't want people to give up too early, that is the big thing. And I would agree with that. You get married in Vegas on Friday, and you get it annulled. I don't know how long Brittany was married after the Vegas married, but clearly people are like, that defiles the sanctity of marriage. Well, no, it doesn't, because I don't agree that there's some sanctity of marriage. What there's sanctity in, if anything, and this might be the first time I've ever used this word in a positive sense since I left religion, is there's sanctity in respecting human dignity, and there's sanctity in having relationships where we recognize the truth of the situation. And if the truth is, no matter how much we might have wanted it otherwise, if we have legitimately tried and cannot come to some sort of reconciliation with a partner, then it may in fact be the case, and I would argue likely is on many occasions, that a separation, a divorce, is the best course of action. But in any case, the government doing what it can to sanction marriage and protect kids and all this other stuff, it's failing. And the motivations to keep people married and to make sure that it's just straight people who are married are failing more people because there are kids who need families and gay couples can adopt. And some of those families might turn out to be an absolute disaster. But you know what? Some or many of the heterosexual marriages are absolute disasters as well. Because I'm not going to wax philosophic about other people's views on relationships. But to say that the government should be opposed to same-sex marriage in order to protect a traditional view of family that is compatible with your particular religion takes everybody else's views of family and puts them at an automatic lower tier. Your family is not as valid as my family. Your family is not as justified as my family. And oh my gosh, when homosexuals wanted to get married, I was like, let them be as miserable and divorced as everybody else is. Let them mess up their kids so that they have to pay for therapy for years, because that's what the rest of us have been doing. I don't find that particularly reasonable argument.
Sure. So to clarify, I didn't say that. What I said was the ab initio, right? From the initial position where government has no regulations about friendships and romantic relationships, it needs a justification to have a regulation. Otherwise, people should be free to form and dissolve relationships. And for the most part, we are free to form and dissolve relationships as we desire. And what I said was the justification for that is because society has an interest, a compelling governmental interest in continuing to exist into the future, what justifies regulating some relationships is that they are the kinds of relationships apt to issue in children. That it's children, that the state's concern with marriage is children. Now, one further clarification, and that is that what Matt said about divorce can be a good thing is true, but it's actually considerably rarer than Matt thinks. It's only in high conflict, what are called high conflict divorces in the literature. In low conflict marriages, not only are the divorced couple worse off after they split, but the kids are also worse off after they split. And the kids especially end up needing lots more therapy because when mom and dad were getting along and they still split up, the kids often think it's their fault. That's just a clarification of what the social science is on that.
So for the record, I just checked the statistic real quick, and if anybody thinks it's cheating for me to Google something, just ignore that I said this. 40% of children are born outside of marriage. That's an incredibly high percentage to try to argue that the government needs to protect marriage because it's the thing that's most likely to result in kids. The thing that's most likely to result in kids is something that religions are doing as well, which is teaching kids abstinence-only sex education and denying contraception. That is what is resulting in kids.
Well, I didn't say marriage was most likely to result in kids. I said marriage laws are justified all and only for the kinds of human relationships which are apt to issue in children. Right? It's only one.
Why?
It's only one kind because the state has the society has an interest in an orderly reproduction through time. The state has an interest in continuing to exist.
How is that not saying the government has an interest in marriage because marriage, in heterosexual marriage is the one that's most likely to result in kids if 40% of them are born outside of marriage?
Well, it has an interest in those relationships too, right? Precisely because it has an interest in kids, and what we know from...
You make it sound like the government is a religion.
No.
Because religions have an interest in bringing in new people because that's where you get your money. And so if you keep the people and you keep their kids, the kids stay in the church and that's where you get your money. I don't know why a government would ever have a compelling interest to continue fostering new generations in order for the government to exist. The government exists to serve the people, not to produce the people to keep the government going.
Right, but there won't be Social Security or Medicare for either of us if there are no people to have jobs.
There's
to
already
pay
no Social Security for me.
To pay for it, right? So that is why even.
But I'd argue that's not a government interest as much as that's a mistake of our current government interest. whether or not there's going to be Social Security. Of course, the government, because we have Social Security as a policy, has a vested interest in fixing that so they don't screw over everybody who paid into it. But to say that the government has an interest in fostering new generations in order to keep the government going, the government serves the people. It's us who have an interest in fostering new generations, irrespective of the government and irrespective of marriage. If I never had kids, I can't, and neither could my brother, and he adopted, and they adopted through a Christian charity, so cool. I love my niece and nephew probably more than anybody else on the planet. At least of all the people who could call me and say, hey, I need a hand, there's only about 5 that I would run out of this room. Well, I would have run out at the beginning of the debate for about 5. We're almost done, so there's probably 25 or 30 that could call now, and I'd say, hey, sorry, I think we covered it. But and I know that, marriage equality is one piece of this, and we're currently under we have this legal status. But I never have viewed, and don't know that I could view, marriage as something that's there to foster further generations. Because before there was our government, before there was any government, further generations have always come along because we have sex. And if we have it unprotected, it's going to result in kids.
Right. No, I of course agree with that. The issue is that, of course, we are both committed to the idea that the state needs some overwhelmingly important reason to interfere in your life, especially in something as intimate as these issues. And so, of course, from our perspective, like married people, if you're married, a married person's perspective, that's what my marriage is about, is not ensuring that there's an America in 100 years. But that's the only reason you're right. My marriage for me is about love, is about commitment, is about building a shared life together, and other commitments that we have. But the state isn't interested in those projects, or it had better not be. The state's only concern with my marriage or anybody else's relationship is the orderly reproduction through time. I can't think of other good reasons under most circumstances for the state to care about who I'm friends with or who I'm romantically involved with.
So the state should have no concern over whether or not I'm married, since I can't reproduce, and people who are postmenopausal we shouldn't be sanctioning their marriage. That has nothing to do with kids.
Well, we certainly wouldn't want sort of fertility tests involved with marriage. Again, the whole point is not to have the government in it.
If it was about kids, wouldn't we do that?
That's why I very specifically said the type of human relationship which is apt to issue in children.
But the type of human relationship that is apt to issue children has nothing to do with marriage. It has to do with sex.
Right.
So the government should just,
except that marriage is good for the kids, right? Marriage is the
maybe.
goal. Well, I mean, that's what the social science says, and that's what people have. That's why government's in the marriage business.
Sure, if you can, but the government isn't in any sense opposed to divorce. Our government's view on marriage is that Britney Spears could get married in Vegas and get it annulled right away, even if she got pregnant.
Well, not in Texas, right? I mean, that's the thing, is the government is actually interested in stymieing divorce. It's really expensive.
It cost me nothing. I'm in Texas. It cost me, the filing fee, $200.
For most people,
which she paid.
You guys got off easy. For most people, it detonates a bomb in their financial life. It's also slow. For most people, it takes months or even years.
60 days.
You guys got off easy.
60 days from filing. That's just what it is.
Texas loves Matt.
I guess. They just don't care whether or not atheists and infertile people stay married, evidently. Anyway. I didn't have any other question beyond that, and I think we're like.
Are we ready for?
Yeah, let's.
These folks look like they're itching to get in.
So, let's go to Q&A. This microphone right over here. It's very, very simple. You need to have a question germane to tonight's content. Make it 2 minutes or less.
Great. Hi, Matt. My question's for you.
Sure.
My name's Todd. So the whole debate past 30 minutes has kind of veered off a little bit from kind of the case that's in the public consciousness, at least in my mind, that's the case that's really germane is the Masterpiece case. So I have the inevitable hypothetical that we knew might come up.
Okay.
An atheist runs a bakery. This atheist finds infant circumcision to be a moral outrage.
Yeah, that's me. So cool. I'm running a bakery.
Okay. Do you have the right to refuse a custom cake to a Jewish bris on the grounds of your moral outrage to infant circumcision?
So, as I noted before, I have the right to turn down whatever request comes into my bakery for whatever reason. But if I say I won't make a cake for a bris, now I'm engaged in something that is discrimination against a religious view. And go ahead. I didn't know if you.
No, yeah. No,
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so then I'm engaged in what I would consider to be discrimination against a religious view. I don't know fully what the outcome or law on that would be. Most of the time, the Masterpiece thing, in any other context, LGBT, religious cake, bris cake, whatever else, it's probably happened thousands of times and nobody made any big deal about it because by and large, okay, I'll go find another baker. It was about someone complaining, and it's because those people are now have been in a marginalized position and are now suggesting that they're being further marginalized when they should have the same rights to everything else. Okay. So if somebody wanted to make a cake that was like circumcision is good with it written on there, okay, now we're in the speech area. But if you come in, largely I'm not going to ask you what the hell you want a cake for. Hey, we're having a party. I want a cake. What do you want it to look like? Cool, done. It's
So
not my job.
does it add anything, though, to the notion that the bris in the Jewish religion is actually a sacrament? It's a religious observance.
No, I think that should be illegal even though it is a religious sacrament.
Okay.
And I think it's genital mutilation, and that there's no medical necessity for it, and that any medical benefits are something that we could wait until they're of age to evaluate the things in consent. And considering that we have rabbis giving infants syphilis by biting off the bris with their mouth, I think it should be absolutely illegal. I don't think anybody's religious freedom should be so codified and protected under the law that they are allowed to do harm to somebody else.
You just agreed with the majority opinion and the First Liberty Institute, which is a Christian advocacy organization for people of faith that go before the Supreme Court, in the Masterpiece case as it relates to this baker refusing on the exact same grounds to participate in another religion. Literally.
He didn't refuse to participate on
Yes,
behalf of
it's a
another.
sacrament in his religion. The act of marriage is a sacrament, and two men or two women being married as a sacrament in his religion is not his religion.
So it's curious that you say I just agreed with something. So I'm clearly not understanding.
So if it's not legal, or if it's not right for the Jewish couple to be refused, or the Jewish couple to be refused, then it's not right for the.
No, I would argue that it would be wrong to refuse a Jewish couple on the grounds that they're Jewish.
I understand, but you're right. You're right to refuse them because of their religious beliefs, because of your beliefs about their religion are the same thing as what the baker's doing in the cake case, the Masterpiece cake case.
No, I said that I would have the right to refuse any contract for whatever reason.
Compelled
but if
artistic.
I expressed it, if I was a baker and said I'm refusing to make this cake because these people are Jewish and it's for a bris and I'm opposed to that, then I would expect to be sued.
Okay, and you expect it to be sued and to lose, and that it would be.
I don't know for sure whether or not I'd lose. Evidently, I probably wouldn't now. However, whether or not you stand by your convictions is independent from whether or not a Jewish family has the same rights under the law. Now, I mean, I don't know if that clears it up anymore.
It does.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi there. Question for Dr. Stewart. Thanks so much for the presentation. It was really interesting. The phrase that you used, over and over, the thumb putting the weight on the scale in favor of freedom for religious
free
expression,
exercise of
free
religion.
exercise. That's an interesting phrase, and I'm wondering, do we find that phrase, is there either that phrase specifically or that idea echoed in the framers of the Constitution or the architects of the Bill of Rights, Madison, Jefferson, et cetera? Is there the sense that they wanted that to be the case?
Sure. So I think that colloquialism is probably newer than that. So I'm not sure how it's a description of what I think they in fact did by specifically marking out the free exercise of religion as a protected zone. That to go inside that, for government to go inside that zone and infringe upon sincerely held beliefs, as the court now phrases it, requires two conditions to be met. One, that it is a compelling governmental interest, right? So this is an essential government purpose. And two, that when they do it, even for a really compelling governmental purpose, they have to adopt the least restrictive means available. Now, we don't set those two conditions about very many other limitations and rules that government can pass at all, right? It passes all kinds of rules about where you can drive and where you can park and how you manufacture different products and what you can sell when and when you can operate and when you can make noise and all sorts of things that are regulated in life. We hardly carve out any sort of protected zones, surround them with cones and say, don't go in there, or if you do, you have to be really careful. But this is one of those areas, and that's really what I mean by a thumb on the scale, is that our default position is that people can live by their faith. Now, there are limits to that, and that's what the thumb on the scale can be overcome by a weight heavy enough to pull it down on the other side. So if your religion says you should sacrifice virgins to the new moon, you should expect the government agents to show up at your door to stop you from doing that, right?
What if the virgins volunteer?
Because
Should they have the right to sacrifice themselves?
I don't think so.
I thought Zach was I thought of something earlier, and I thought you were getting ready to say it, because I can think of no other context where the phrase thumb on a scale is viewed as anything other than cheating. Thumb on a scale has never been viewed as fair.
And I wonder about that, and specifically, so I get that that's your interpretation of that. What I'm thinking of, do we get any sense from the writings of the founders that that interpretation is what they had in mind? Because again, as Matt said, that seems like cheating in favor of religion, and
Right.
and it doesn't seem like that's the sort of thing that,
Well,
that Madison or Jefferson would have been in favor of.
Sure. There, I think the phrase may be a distraction then. So let's abandon that. And what we're saying
Just the
is...
concept. The
Yeah,
concept that
the
religion gets special privilege.
Well, that's just what the First Amendment is, right? In the same way that speech gets special protection, that owning
Right.
firearms gets special protection,
Sure.
right? That is just a description of what those amendments
But
are.
my question is, do we get any sense from the writings of the architects of that amendment?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
that's what they had in mind.
Yeah, that's
can
exactly-
Can you cite anything?
Yeah, so in all the discussions about the Bill of Rights, that's what all the discussions are about, is which things do we pick out as so essential that we're going to specify them, with the risk, as Matt pointed out, that if we specify these things, people might think that no other freedoms are protected, just those. And the response from the Anti-Federalists were, we're not signing that Constitution. We're not ratifying that Constitution in the states that we control unless a whole bunch of these things are protected. And that's how we got the list.
So who was it then that was saying these things specifically?
Yeah, so those are the delegates to the Constitutional Convention. So Madison's notes at the convention are a helpful place to go.
That said that religion should have a special
Well, it's
privilege.
not only religion, right? It's freedom
But
of
I'm asking
speech.
specifically about religion,
Yeah.
right? Did they have this idea in mind that religion specifically should be privileged, and there should be a kind of a thumb on the scale for those questions?
Yeah, it was pretty broadly understood. The view back then that was very popular was that religion was the source of the virtue of the people that the state required but couldn't provide.
Okay.
And so that's one of the reasons why religion was marked out. Also, as Matt pointed out, other reasons included that people tend to fight about it, right? Religious issues get testy, so we want to mark those off. Another is that there were lots of faiths. A number of the states had established religions.
Yes.
And so that was going to create a problem. And so that's why some of the provisions are what they are.
I think one of the points of
Okay.
contention here is on the word special. And so if I list several things, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of press, et cetera, you could view that as if I'm singling those out as if they're more important than others. And I would argue that that's not what the First Amendment does. It doesn't necessarily single those out as if they're special in that they're more important than others. It singles them out as special as that they're the ones we chose to specifically acknowledge, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your freedom of religion trumps some other, I hate using that word now, should supersede or have primacy over some other, as if your freedom of religion is somehow more important than your right to vote, or your freedom of religion is somehow more important than whether or not we should no longer have slaves, or the freedom of religion is more important than whether or not women get to vote, which I have to keep reminding people wasn't a thing until fairly recently.
75 years.
Yeah. It's bizarre because I'm 50, so it's been that way for my whole life, and I don't know at what age I figured out that it only come in, 25 years before I was born. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I have a question for Dr. Stewart. You were saying that, in your view, that the government is justified in having a role in caring about who gets married because it wants to, marriages that are most likely to result in children, and that's why they were opposed to LGBT marriages. Why is it, if that's the case, why is the government also opposed to polygamy or consensual polygamy? Because that's going to result in even more children than just two people.
Right. So just to make sure it's clear, my view is that of all the sorts of friendships and romantic relationships that we have, the only one that the government is justified in picking out for regulating, in making it harder to form and harder to dissolve, and getting all in the business as we form and dissolve these, charging us fees to do it, are those which it has a compelling interest in, and the only ones that it has a compelling state interest in are the kinds of relationships apt to issue in children. Now, with polygamy, there are a variety of reasons why the government might oppose polygamy.
Yeah, which ones are the ones that have to do with children?
Right. So there, I think it's there. I don't remember all the arguments that were advanced because this, of course, was a constitutional issue. Utah was told that it could not become a state until it outlawed polygamy. And so there was a fight about this. And I forget it's so distant to us now, polygamy, that I forget exactly what all the arguments.
And that was exactly as effective as outlawing marijuana. Yeah.
So what is your position on polygamy then?
I had better be for having only one wife. my wife
And not for any God reasons, just because he's got a wife now.
I've got one, right?
It's funny because you said that the government's only interest in regulating relationships should be those that are apt to issue children. And I would argue that the government has a vested interest in pretty much any relationships and contract that affects people and their rights. So whether or not I marry, I'll probably never marry anybody again, but whether or not I marry a woman or a man, the marriage contract basically combines everything about our lives and combines our finances and other things like that. Shouldn't the government have an interest in protecting all of its citizens who enter into contracts and unions with people, irrespective of whether or not it issues an adult child?
Right, but that sort of begs the question, because we don't have contracts with most of our friendships, and I had no contracts with girlfriends. Right, the only relationship I've had that the only romantic or relationship or friendship that I've had that resembles in any way or has a parallel or nexus with a contract is my marriage.
Well, that's why my solution is to actually make it a contract. You get rid of the institution of marriage from a government standpoint entirely, and you have a contractual obligation with somebody. There are people who have suggested, let's get married for a month, 5 years, whatever else. Because if we really look at what's happening here, there are two people who are convinced, and evidently half the time for really bad reasons, we'd like to stay together forever. So let's join our families, let's entangle our finances, let's present ourselves as a couple, let's get a house together, let's share property and all these other things. That is all stuff that would normally be done under contract law, as if I were a corporation. My wife and I were essentially a government-sanctioned corporation of two for 8 years or so. And so as long as we're going to have those sorts of things, I'd rather it was just handled with a contract. But if we want to do the shorthand version, because there's a reason people fought for marriage equality as opposed to just civil unions. Because civil unions, you still have to jump through more hoops than somebody who just got married. When my wife and I got married, it was, hey, here you go, here's your certificate, blah, blah, blah. Would you like to change your name? Nope, now you're married and you can do whatever you want. When you say, marriage is between a man and a woman, and you have a civil union that homosexual couples can get involved with, now they have to jump through other hoops. As a matter of fact, one of my former co-hosts, when she married her wife, despite the fact that they were already married at the time that her wife became pregnant, she had to go through the extra process of adopting that child in order that it legally be theirs. And when we're talking about people at end-of-life issues where, you can create a power of attorney letter that gives somebody the authority to make decisions about your life. But you don't have to do that if you're married. If you're in a civil union, you would have to. And so there were special hoops to jump through. Now, if the government is going to address all of those components of this contract between a couple of people, then I would argue that it must have an interest in regulating that contract so that it's fair for all citizens, even if their union is never going to and could not possibly result in children. Because they're citizens, and it's citizens that are protected, not potential future offspring. Or not merely, because the future offspring are protected.
I have a question for both of you. Oh, thank you. I have a question for both of you, actually, which is, where do rights come from?
Oh, this is so good. I'll do this and do it quick, and then you can jump in and correct me.
Sure.
I did a debate with Abdu Murray in Lubbock, Texas. It was all about rights. It was the first non-just God type debate that I had done publicly. Because we have within the Declaration of Independence that there are certain inalienable rights, and they appeal to the God of providence or some abstract God and not necessarily a Judeo-Christian God, et cetera. I think they're wrong. I think that what they were trying to say about inalienable rights is what they viewed as that our rights should be. But to say that you have a right that is not codified or guaranteed by any governing authority is pointless. What you're really saying is, I should have this right. Only those rights which are guaranteed and codified by the governing authority are actually rights, and everything else is something that you wish was a right or think should be a right.
I don't agree with that. I know that comes as a great surprise and shock. I think rights always exist in tandem with duties, even if it's only the duty to forbear, meaning the duty not to interfere. And so oftentimes what we're describing as rights, it's actually the duties that came first. So children have a right to an education. This is Pierce versus Society of Sisters. Children have a right to an education because parents have a duty to educate children. So that's one example. Other rights I buy the whole natural rights things, that in virtue of being the kinds of creatures we are, there are certain kinds of infringements on our life and liberty that would always and everywhere be wrong. And so a right is a pretty handy word for using when it would either always or almost always be wrong to trammel this area. Then a right has become a pretty handy way of referring to that.
Thank you.
I just have a question for both of y'all. Kind of in the conversation that's been going on about the Bill of Rights too, it kind of seems like, why do we need the Bill of Rights? Why did it even happen? It was in our Constitution, but I'd like for y'all to talk about kind of like other countries, like for example, the Mexican Constitution, that is very similar to ours, but they don't have a Bill of Rights. And because of that, throughout time, for example, the right to bear arms is in the Mexican Constitution. But over time, now there's been so much restriction on buying arms that really it's the military, the police, and the drug lords that have a lot of them, and a lot of people die because of it. Secondly, freedom of religion is also in theirs. But in the early 1900s, the Cristero War was outlawing Catholicism and put to death a lot of people. And so in kind of I am uncomfortable with the talk of the not need and like, oh, they were just afraid. Well, yeah, we're human beings. Like they were afraid, so they made the Bill of Rights. The talking the Bill of Rights, they have a usefulness to accent to say, okay, at bare minimum, these are the major things that we are. So in a way, the right to bear arms, freedom of religion, those have extra weight in a society and in governmental ways that we try to make everything one size fits all when it always does not work like that. You know, you can't just make a law that affects everybody, but it seems like laws are growing and adapting and figuring, well, what is just, because what's the purpose of the law, you know, in the end. So kind of talking about that, about the Bill of Rights, of how they have helped.
I have no problem. I mean, I have objections to things here and there. I'm not too mad that we created the Bill of Rights, no matter what the reason was. I think all of those things were implicitly protected, and some people wanted to make them explicitly protected. I don't know what good it does to point to a country that has a protection in their Constitution that they're no longer guaranteeing or that has fallen into disarray or anything else. But the bigger thing is, and I hate to come back this way, is I, for the life of me, can't see what impact it has on your life or his life if I marry a man. And even if it's somebody's strongly held religious conviction that this is an abomination, okay, then really what you're suggesting is either you're offended, and I don't mean this at you. I have no idea what your views are, and the nature of your question didn't reveal anything, so I'm not directing this at you. But if somebody says that, they're opposed to a man marrying another man, what you're either telling me is you're offended, in which case I don't care, because you don't have a right to not be offended, or your God's offended. And if your God's offended, he can come down and do something about it. And it's obvious, I'm still not meaning that at you, but when we talk about the Bill of Rights or what we're going to protect, and this gets back to the last question that was asked, I don't know what it means to say I have a right that no one is guaranteeing or protected. I do know what it means to say I should have this right and it's not protected. That is where we would agree. The thing that people probably suspect we disagreed on the last question about rights isn't, I don't think anybody in their right mind thinks that it makes sense to say I have this right and nobody's protecting it. What you're really saying is I think I should have this right and you're not protecting it, and that results in convincing people that you should have this right. And when you convince enough people, under the legal system that you're under, then all of a sudden there's a law that protects that right. The United States' protected rights are different from Great Britain. When I'm over in the UK, I'm subject to blasphemy laws on occasion, and I violate them every single time I can. I beg them to arrest me so that I can show what I find is wrong with their law. I'm willing to go to jail for it. I'm not saying that I have that right in England. I'm making the case that I think England is wrong to deny that right. That's a perspective on opinion. If anybody thinks, Matt's just about the law and doesn't think that there's dignity in human life. No, I think life has meaning, purpose, and dignity, but it's what we bring to it. It's not something intrinsic to it. The universe doesn't care about us as humans, but we do. And that's why we work to protect rights. It's funny to me, you'll see politicians who were strongly opposed to same-sex marriage completely flip the second their homosexual nephew, cousin, child comes out. And that lets me know that quite a lot of cases, it's not an intellectual exercise. It's not an appeal to ideology. We're emotional creatures who care about other people. Empathy is what hopefully drives our sense of what is right and just. And my personal view is that in many cases, antiquated religious views are constructed in such a way that they trump our natural, there I go with that word again, our natural inclination towards empathy. And this is why I'm such a huge proponent of John Rawls' veil of ignorance, because that is the best method I know of to get us past the bias. And even if we don't agree on what the solution is, I have yet to meet anybody who doesn't say, yeah, Rawls' veil of ignorance. Of course, pick the world you want to be in, not knowing who you're going to be. And the thing is that some people will look at a situation and say, yeah, I'm fine with living in a society where same-sex couples aren't allowed to get married, even if I am in fact a same-sex I have a same-sex attraction. There are people who fit in that category. So for them, the veil of ignorance would come down and, yeah, there's no problem with it. It's not the same for me. And it's never going to be. We're not all going to agree, which is why we try to have, we went all over the place tonight. I don't know that we got to how to resolve the conflict, because my view is, as I stated, when your religious views come in conflict with somebody else's rights, you lose. But what I didn't say is, what if my religious views come into conflict with rights someone thinks they should have but are not currently guaranteed? That's a different issue.
So you asked about the Bill of Rights, and I think you point us to something really interesting, which is the way that political discourse in America surrounds rights. We tend to just see that as the water in which we swim, right? The air that we breathe. But you're speaking about the UK, which actually is sort of close on that. But you go to the European continent, and you'll find it's very different. And an author named Marianne Glendon wrote a really fascinating book that you might want to read called Rights Talk, where she looks at kind of the different ways of doing political discourse in various countries. And what she finds is that if this isn't too pejorative, our kind of obsession with rights talk pushes us to extremes on positions. So an example that she uses that will be near and dear to Matt's heart is abortion law, where if abortion law matched kind of where the population's opinions are in the U.S., we would not probably look that different from Europe, although a lot of Americans are surprised to learn that European laws are much more restrictive on abortion than American laws are. Glendon's claim is that part of why we wound up with this weird disjunction between what the law is and kind of what the median view is in the Pew Research polling data or some other reliable source is that we punted it to the Supreme Court, and with an emphasis on rights talk, they took an all-or-nothing approach.
Right? Well, with privacy.
Yeah, and it was privacy, where if it had been without that sort of fixation on rights talk, again, which part of the argument is that's engendered by a Bill of Rights, which specifies, right, and enumerates all these particular rights as core to what the country is about. That's what the Bill of Rights did. And so in some ways, she's in a very gentle way sort of criticizing that.
And two quick notes, and I'll move on to the other question. Just for your information, my personal view is that I think abortion was correctly ruled, but for the wrong reasons. And that puts it in jeopardy. Also, when I talked about going to the UK and blasphemy, I never wanted to draw a picture of Muhammad until some Muslims told me I couldn't. And I did. I participated in Draw Muhammad Day. I'll do it all over the place. Would I go to Bangladesh and blaspheme? Would I go to Bangladesh and be an outspoken atheist? No, because they kill atheists in the street there. I work with organizations that are helping people escape where you don't have that religious freedom. The reason I would do it in the UK is I think they're a little bit wrong, but generally sensible. Another country where I don't have rights to express myself at all, or where I don't have a right to not believe whatever the state religion is, and that comes at penalty of death, well, I'm not going to claim that I would run over and do that because I'd like to keep living. I'd rather fight them from across the street rather than going onto that street. And so we're helping atheists in Bangladesh and in other places escape religious persecution.
I would like to go on record as opposed to killing atheists.
Thank you. See, we win.
Someone, finally. Yeah. Well, and just to point out that I think that the hard part is what we're discussing tonight is that really when it comes down to morality, like what we view as moral or good or law, I mean, law cannot be without morality. You have a set of morality. Sure, you have a set of The law is not necessarily based on morals at all, and we don't legislate morality. There are things that we consider more immoral that aren't illegal, and there are things that are illegal that we don't consider immoral. I know a lot of libertarians who would agree with that.
No, it's a fact. The speed limit's 55 miles an hour. That's a law, but it doesn't necessarily have a moral component.
Why?
Meanwhile, it is perfectly immoral, I would think, to cheat on your spouse, and yet, with the exception of a couple antiquated laws in a couple states, it's not illegal. They're not unified.
Yeah, we've got 20
minutes.
They
overlap.
We've got 20 minutes for Q&A. So let's move on.
I'll give shorter answers.
So my question's mainly for Matt. I have a question before the question in light of what Todd came up and asked you. How do you feel about gender reassignment surgery for children?
Well, so I'm not a medical professional, and I opt to leave it in the hands of those people who are. And so what we know about gender identity, gender expression, the simplest thing for me is trans rights or human rights, but people are concerned about this issue of, what do children know? When you talk to people about their sexuality, most people get an inkling of what their sexuality is long before they are actually active.
Can I interrupt? Because gender and sexuality...
I know. I'm building to a point. I'm not saying they're the same at all. I'm using this as an analogy to get to the other one.
The question was gender as far as sexual, but it's gender, yeah.
I'm using this as an analogy to get to that. So people understand about their sexuality even before they realize they understand about their sexuality. There's no reason to think that people don't understand about their gender before that this is acutely aware for them. I don't know at what age we should start doing anything, but I know that denial of this is resulting in suicides, and that if someone begins to transition before puberty, the results of that are far superior than if they begin to transition after puberty. There are a number of different paths to this, including hormone blockers that basically stall puberty until you get to an age where you can potentially understand and consent, and we get, doctors' approvals. But I'm not a doctor, and I don't think I get to decide when is the right time for somebody else to transition. But I'm going to be supportive of the medical experts, and I'm going to be supportive of people's right to identify and control their own life and live with dignity, irrespective of what somebody else thinks about their gender identity forever.
So you constantly speak of religious views, not rights, even though it's in the Constitution.
What's in the Constitution?
Freedom of religion and
yeah,
practice.
But that's not. So when I talk about the Constitution doesn't codify any specific religious view. It just says you have a right to your religious views.
But these are feelings people have that there's a God, right? Gender is feelings, right?
Well,
how they feel.
Gender is generally, in modern terms, viewed as a social construct that we have
okay,
genetic sex.
Whatever the motivation is to change,
sure,
it's how they feel.
Okay.
Is that different from how a person feels about God?
Is it different from how a person feels about God in what way?
Well,
at least I know that gender, whether it's a social construct or not, exists. I have no evidence that a God exists. So yeah, they're different.
Well, but these are feelings of what you should be,
or
what you want to change to be.
No, so all right. So there's.
I mean, all of these things. Homosexuality is a feeling that motivates, the love or the behavior, right? But with religion, it's a view.
So religion is you can call it a feeling.
Well, I'm just saying that people feel that there is a God.
Whether or not you believe there's a God is a question about what you are convinced of. Whether or not there is a God is a question of fact, which nobody can demonstrate.
Okay.
When we talk about and I'm going to build to an analogy here. When we talk about whether or not I'm attracted to a man or a woman or both, yes, those are feelings, but they are facts about what I'm experiencing. And the same thing is true when we talk about how someone identifies with respect to gender, and gender identity is separate from gender expression because how somebody identifies is independent of how they might dress or act or whether they want to go through a surgical or chemical process to transition. I'm not quite sure what it means to say, aren't they both just feelings? And what's even if I said, yes, they're both just feelings, where do we get?
Well, I mean, some feelings are more important than other feelings in this context then.
If you have a view that there's a God and God is opposed to people transitioning from one gender identity or from one assigned gender to another, what difference does it make to your God belief if they do it? And what right do you have to impose on somebody else's thing? It would be the same as if a trans person came up to you and said, well, you don't think that I have the right to transition? You no longer have the right to believe in God.
Well, this gets me to the second question, okay? I find your statement about the pharmacist telling If the pharmacist doesn't want to sell birth control, was it? Then he doesn't get to be a pharmacist, right?
Correct, because that's a requirement of the job.
Well, is it?
Yes,
If he doesn't want
it
to
is.
sell,
The requirement of a pharmacist is to dispense the medicine prescribed by the doctor, not to step in and say, I don't care what your doctor said, my religion says you don't get that.
well, but he doesn't, the pharmacist may not want to dispense fentanyl.
Tough. You're a pharmacist. You are a medical dispenser, not a judge about what medicines people should or
He
shouldn't
doesn't
get.
have to carry it, right? It just doesn't have to carry it.
Actually, there are requirements on what pharmacies are expected to carry.
Okay.
But there's a difference between saying, hey, we're out of it or we don't carry that versus I'm not giving you that because of my religion.
Well, what we have is that if you don't want to bake a cake, you can't be a baker.
That's not what I said.
You don't want to make the flowers, you can't be a florist.
That's
If you
not
don't
what I
want
said
to be
either.
if you're a Catholic, then you can't be a judge because, no, you're.
Didn't say anything like that either.
No, but the point is, as you go, if you don't want to give certain type of insurance, it's not your. You have to give the.
Didn't say that either. You can straw man me for the rest of the day, but the fact of the matter is, a pharmacist is there to dispense medicine, not inject their religion.
Well, but a baker is there to bake cakes.
Okay, let's say you need heart medicine and I'm your pharmacist, but my sincere religious view is that God doesn't want people taking medicine to fix their heart because people need to die, so I'm not going to give you your heart medicine. Based on my personal religious conviction, you don't get your heart medicine. Is that fine?
Well, why you say if the baker doesn't want to bake a cake, then they don't have to bake a cake.
Can we just not stick with the pharmacist? I said the baker doesn't have to bake a cake because a baker, this is not an essential service. This is not a bakery down the street is not an essential service. It's not required for anybody. It's not regulated by the government. You don't have drug inspectors coming in to make sure the flour that you're using is actual proper baking flour. These things are in different categories. If you want to be a pharmacist, you have to do the job, and you don't get to say, I'm not doing that part of the job because of my religious convictions, ever.
Can I ask a clarifying question there? Sure. If there are more than one pharmacist working in the shop, would you favor the other pharmacist saying, hey, I realize you don't like that, so anytime a patient comes in for that, I'm gonna do that for you? Or do you insist that we terminate any pharmacist who holds these beliefs that you don't think fits them for their job?
So this is the incredibly privileged status that I talked about before, and I suffer from it as well, in that generally people with pharmacy options would say, oh, you could go to another pharmacy or whatever else. And then if there's only one pharmacy option, the answer becomes what you said, which is, well, we'll just have two pharmacists there, and the one that doesn't want to give out contraception or whatever else their religion prohibits, we'll have the other pharmacist dispense that. What if that pharmacist is sick and that person needs something? My answer is, if you can't do the job, you can't do the job.
Okay, but in the hypothetical, if there's another pharmacist around, are you opposed to making an accommodation where it's possible?
I'm not. So, let's say you're the pharmacist who has a religious objection to dispensing whatever. We'll go with contraceptions, and I don't. If we're both there working, and I know that you have that, I'll fulfill this prescription. However, if I'm not there, you have to fill that prescription, because that's the requirement of the job. It's fine to offload it on the person who's not bothered by it, but if you are so bothered by it that you can't do it when you are required to as the only one there, you don't get that job.
So in a state where euthanasia is legal and a doctor doesn't want to do it for religious reasons, he can't be a doctor or her? What?
First of all, we don't have any states where euthanasia is legal, although I think all of them should legalize it.
Okay.
I'm in favor of death with dignity. However, this particular example that you're coming up with of euthanasia, there's a difference between whether or not an individual is required to do it or whether or not somebody in that profession would be required to do it. And doctors take a Hippocratic oath, and there's going to be big debates when it comes to death with dignity about the do no harm part of it. But if the medical view is that this is a medically responsible and medically necessary end-of-life death with dignity thing, then I would think they would be required to do that.
And they can't be a doctor if they don't.
Well, you can get a degree. You can't practice medicine. You can go earn your pharmacy certificate, but you don't get to work in a pharmacy unless you're willing to do the requirements of the job. Just like I can't, once upon a time I worked for a construction company, and the guy, we were working on a 12-12 pitch and doing roofing, and he didn't believe in putting up nailer boards or any kind of protection, and there's a 3-story drop off the back, and I was like, you guys are nuts, you need some protection up here. And he's like, hey, angels are hanging onto my feet. But if my job is to and there's other safety concerns, I don't get to say, you know what, it's against my religion to be on a 12-12 pitch. Because if the job requires me to roof a 12-12 pitch roof, I don't get to take the job, expect to get paid for the job, and then say, oh, I can't do the job because of my religion. If your religion prevents you from doing the job, you don't do the job.
Okay.
And if we can make the argument that you can go find another pharmacy, then I'd make the argument we can go hire another pharmacist who doesn't suffer that same religious baggage. And that's a far more practical solution.
I want to thank you both. It's been a great evening. Dr. Stewart, my question is for you. I'm sure my T-shirt surprises you with that. During the course of your prepared remarks and then later in the dialogue that you shared with Matt and even in some of the questions, you used the term thumb on the scale. And I think maybe you have sort of backed away from that idea. But
I think he's fully retracted it at this point.
At this point, perhaps. But I get the point you were trying to make is that the free exercise clause, right, it was particularly important in the construct of the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment. And is it still fair to say that you believe that the free exercise clause really is kind of the predominant freedom in the First Amendment? Are you suggesting that?
Well, what I've said is it is the first one, and I think I'm not suggesting a pecking order among that and freedom of speech, freedom of the press, but rather
there's 6 things in there, right?
But that these things are featured, right, is what makes them important. Right. That they are featured is what makes them weightier, and that's what I meant by thumb on the scale. It's harder to overcome the default setting, which is we don't mess with that. And you can fill into that with all of those other things listed in those instances. And that's what I meant by thumb.
Okay. I think Matt's very first question to you was, what do you do when somebody else's, he's talking about the swinging your fist in someone else's nose. What do we do when your free exercise right is in conflict with my free speech right? How does one resolve that? How do we resolve your free exercise right when it comes to my right to petition the government for redress of grievances, right? That the fact that I can't think of a scenario off the top of my head is irrelevant. It is an intellectual exercise. We're talking about the 6 things that we have listed in the very First Amendment, and I still don't know that I've heard a very good answer from you from the very first question Matt posed to you, and so I frame it like this. I've got 6 things in the very First Amendment, and you're saying that one of those is sort of the first among equals. How do we resolve that when those rights now are in conflict with each other between 2 individuals?
Right. No,
how's that resolved?
I take free exercise. So my prepared remarks and our other discussion is focused on free exercise because that's what's primarily at issue in conflicts between religious liberty, right, and LGBT
and this
rights claims.
Yeah.
That's what the discussion is about, and that's why I focused more on that.
Okay.
I mean, I'd have to think about what it would look like for someone's, maybe Matt has a hypothetical or an actual case off the top of his head of where a free speech right and a free exercise right went head to head and we had to pick one or the other.
You'd almost have to invent like a religion or blasphemy laws.
Right.
Blasphemy laws which protect religion are going to come up against, we don't have those here, but they do in the UK.
That'd be a good example of blasphemy law.
Yeah, so I mean, a blasphemy law would fail in our country would fail the Sherbert test / RFRA test of compelling governmental interest achieved using the narrowly tailored, right, the most narrowly tailored means available.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And literally 10 seconds because I want to get to everybody else. My view of free exercise of religion is about what you do and not about what you prevent other people from doing.
Hi. Thank you both for coming tonight to take the time to engage in civil, constructive debate over important issues. I think that alone is important to do. So thank you for that.
Thank you for coming.
So, Matt, well, this question is kind of for both of you, but Matt, you said, quote, in your opening talk that religion doesn't need protection, which was surprising to me given history. Surprised me enough to write it down, that
I was talking about the fact that it's only unpopular speech that requires protection. Nobody needs to protect popular speech. And so the majority religion doesn't need protection, but it's minority religions that need
But
protection.
who is in the majority or in the minority? If we look at
Yes,
history,
it changes.
right? It changes a lot. Therefore, religion does need protection.
Oh, I agree.
And I also thought it was interesting how you said when rights conflict with freedom, rights win every time, and yet that seems to me to be just playing with words, because aren't we talking about the right to buy a cake, the right to adopt a child, the right to practice your religion? That's also a right. So it seemed like simple trickery as a magician to say when rights come up against freedom, rights win. Well, the right to practice your religion is a right, so that isn't very helpful rhetoric.
Sure, so the right to practice a religion is a right, but that is independent from independent religious views. And so your religious views aren't necessarily protected. You could have sincerely held religious views that while you have a right to hold them, will never be protected for your right to actually take action upon them. I could have a sincerely convicted religion, well, that was the example that I gave, that people who believe in superstition or in the supernatural shouldn't be allowed to vote. That can be entirely my view. Nobody can take it away. Nobody can do anything about it. I'm free to act upon it in a limited sense of trying to convince other people and everybody else, but I cannot actually impede someone else's right to vote based on my personal religious conviction.
So I totally agree with you that our rights and our freedoms have limits, and that the right to practice your religion, freedom of religion, definitely needs a limit. My concern in your argument is when you say that when this one group's right comes up against the right to practice religion in a particular context, such as baking cake or and I want to talk about medicine too, that this person simply just shouldn't be a baker in the public square.
I've never said anything about somebody shouldn't be a baker.
You said they
shouldn't.
in
the public square. Keep going, sorry.
Public square, right? And that is marginalizing. So saying that would marginalize the person who wants to hold to their freedom of conscience in a way that has a significant impact on their financial and social engagement. So basically, it's marginalizing people with religious held convictions from the public square. So here's where I want to
get. They marginalize themselves by coming in conflict with foundational rights.
Well, and this is why I thought your opening talk was very helpful of how do we find peace and compromise as much as possible in a society, in a pluralistic society, unless we're going to, yes, I think that was important and helpful. And I thought that, Kevin, your distinction between shelf goods and customs goods was very helpful. And I don't want this question to go too long, so I'm not going to say why I thought that was helpful. What I want to get to is wondering, and Matt, I also think it was very important to talk about that freedom of religion within medical practice is kind of a big deal, and this is where this conflict can come to a head. And it's absolutely unacceptable for someone who is a doctor to have a black person or a transgender woman come into the emergency room from a car accident and refuse the medical care because you don't agree with their lifestyle. That's unacceptable. There should be a limit to that freedom of religion. But what I'm wondering is, just like the shelf goods versus the custom goods, which we don't have time for me to explain why I think that's really helpful, could there be a distinction made between medical care that supports the healthy functioning of the body, and there's no grounds for refusing that kind of care, but a distinction made between medical treatments that harm the normal functioning of the body?
There is. It's essential and non-essential.
Well, but in terms of transgender treatments in particular, euthanasia, abortion, these things ask a doctor to harm what is a healthy, functioning organ. And that is why most Christians or most religious people I know who would have an objection to performing that, it's because of the Hippocratic Oath. It's because they have sworn to take care, to do no harm to a healthy body. So could a distinction like that be a helpful way of creating a peace and in a pluralistic society? And have there been any legal cases that seek to make that distinction? Has anyone tried to make that distinction? Any precedent? That's my question.
Sure. So
either of you.
the biggest problem there is that, yeah, we make a distinction between medically essential and medically non-essential. I would argue that routine infant circumcision is medically non-essential, in addition to being morally repugnant. One of which is a medical assessment, one of which is my personal assessment, which I think has good reasons. Now, when you talk about medical professionals refusing to do a sex reassignment surgery because it harms a functioning organ, well, the human body is more than just an organ. And probably the most important organ in the human body is the brain. And considering, in many cases, refusing to help someone or support someone's transition from the gender they were assigned at birth to the gender that they believe they are is incredibly harmful to the most important organ and results in people's suicide and death. Even if you wanted to think, and even if there was evidence for, and there's not, the notion that gender identity is merely a psychological thing.
Hasn't Lisa Diamond shown that gender is
finish?
fluid? So you're just saying that it's shown. I would like to see your statistical.
Okay, well, I didn't march in with a bunch
research
of
on that.
statistics, but I didn't say what you just accused me of saying.
I just said that what I know, Lisa Diamond, who's a LGBT researcher, has shown that sense of gender and sexual attraction changes, that people go back from being straight to gay.
Yes,
and
it's
a sense
entirely
of,
possible. There's an entire category called gender fluid of
It's
people
fluid.
who, that's not true for everybody. The fact that it is true does not make it true for everybody. And if we are stuck in a position where someone, where we don't have, even if it was a mental
But
illness.
statistics
oh
show
my
if
God.
you let,
Go ahead, you finish.
Well, you've gotten to talk a lot tonight.
Yeah, I'm the one that's here to talk, and I'm trying to answer your question, but you keep interrupting before I get to the relevant points. So I'm done.
Last question.
Yeah, my question is simply this. When we started, we were looking at how can we resolve the conflicts between the rights of the LGBT community and the firmly held religious beliefs of other people.
We totally did that, I think.
Well, I don't know. I'm asking you then, Matt, how would you resolve with your beliefs the issues that Kevin presented? Kevin, how would you resolve your beliefs with the issues that Matt presented?
2 minutes or less.
Yeah, I can keep it under 2 minutes. I appreciate the question. I think I've addressed everything on some level or another of how I would address those conflicts. There's no easy answer. I'm not in any way trying to deny anybody's religious freedom or their ability to exercise it. I'm just recognizing a limitation that your ability to exercise your religious beliefs is limited when they come in conflict with other people and their rights and their beliefs. And recognizing that you don't get to, you have to work within the system to make the changes. And because we have a secular government that is on secular foundations, we have to have secular arguments for things. You can't just walk in and say, I'm convinced by my religious convictions that this is the way things should be, not just because we generally shouldn't permit that, but because anybody could walk in and say anything is their sincerely held religious conviction. And we don't even have to go to outlandish, varying different views. There's over 1,000 denominations that all identify as Christian that disagree on every single point of doctrine, and that's only within one narrow portion of religion. It's like we could put as many monuments up on the Capitol grounds as we want. There's a Ten Commandments monument there that the Supreme Court ruled should stay, and it's because Justice Breyer invented a grandfather clause out of whole cloth saying this one in here in Texas had been there for years and the one in Kentucky was new, so the one in Kentucky has to come down, this one doesn't. But if we allowed everybody to put up a religious monument on the grounds, there'd be no grass, there'd be no place to walk. And so isn't it much better to say, you are free to have your religious beliefs, but out here on the steps of the Capitol, where we should all be equal under the law, we shouldn't have a monument to your religion that makes everybody else feel and appear inferior, that your religion shouldn't get a preferred status. Just recognizing that. Equality means let's not put up religious monuments on public spaces. And now, how can you possibly have offended anybody except for the people whose view on their religion is that you have to kowtow to my religion? Those are the only people that could possibly be offended by not having a statue of something up.
Oh, I don't have anything to say on that. I'll address it in the concluding remarks.
Okay.
Save us a little time.
It was to both.
Yeah.
Yeah, but okay. Are we doing concluding remarks? I'm done.
Why not?
But you can.
Okay. I was going to give you last word, but I will say a little something. Then maybe you'll decide I've provoked you again.
You can have the last word.
Okay. So I think the difference between us, me and Matt, on this, or one of the core differences, is that when the free exercise of religion comes into conflict with someone else's views, desires, free exercise is the default position is that that person's free exercise wins. That's the law. That's the Constitution. That's the Supreme Court's long history of ruling. That is our country's DNA and our legal history and tradition. Now, that said, humanity has a very checkered record of how we treat one another, right? Often it's quite poor. And given our context conditions, those 3 context conditions I laid out, and given the 4 principles that I laid out, and that free exercise is a right, and that means living according to your sincerely and deeply held beliefs, not simply getting to have them. What our Constitution, our law, and our history require is the widest possible freedom to exercise our religious beliefs consistent with other people's right to do so as well, and within the bounds of compelling governmental interests, right? So it's not an unlimited right, but we've been over a couple times now how those limits work. There's a process for what we consider an okay limit to set up and what's not an okay limit to set up. So what I think I'm offering is a way to de-escalate from some of the dichotomies that Matt has pointed us to, some of the real conflicts that he rightly points us to. For example, dispense these drugs or quit. That as often as possible, we should make common sense accommodations, and we agreed on that with the pharmacist. As often as possible, we should make common sense accommodations for things like pharmacists with sincere and deeply held beliefs, even granting that sometimes we won't be able to do that, right? If it's a truly necessary service that someone has an objection to. So one of the other cases that came up in the history here is pacifists who during the Vietnam War did not want to deliver draft notices. They refused to deliver draft notices. My path, what I'm offering is kind of how we resolve these conflicts, is that if it's possible for us to rotate the schedule in management so that those pacifist letter carriers are not carrying those cards, then that little bit of extra trouble that we take has a huge societal payoff because more people have more opportunities to flourish, and we're all a lot more likely to live in peace with one another. That's what one of my principles is about, that we should actually go in search of those opportunities for how we can say, okay, look, this person's going to face a choice of dispense the drugs or quit. What can I do to offer some kind of third option there? And so what I've tried to outline is the general principles, the form and structure of how we basically it all comes down to that. How we go out there and search for options to allow us to live in peace with one another and have the widest possible ambit for these architectonic beliefs and the free exercise of those. Thank you all for coming tonight. I know it's been a long night and you've been a great audience.
Thank you. No, I told him he could have the last word. I do what I say I'll do.
All right. Well, thank you again, Dr. Stewart, Matt Dillahunty. Thank you sincerely for being calm and respectful and being here. Good night.